Hello friends, welcome to Dead Signal FM. Please, like the video, subscribe, and tell me in the comments where are you watching from tonight. Get comfortable, relax, and let's begin. There were more tents than we brought, and someone was singing inside one of them. I stood there, boots sinking into the muck of Cairngorm's outer reaches. My breath caught in my throat like a small, panicked animal. 5 tents. We had brought 3. The singing had stopped the moment I noticed. Now there was only the high drone of wind through the pines that bordered our clearing, the soft patter of the drizzle that had been following us for days. Ian, you see something? Myra's voice pulled me back to reality. She was kneeling by our cook stove, stirring a pot of stew that smelled of salt and thyme and something gamey I couldn't place. The others, Lachlan and Neve, were still gathering wood along the edge of the clearing. They were too far to have ducked into a tent, let alone set up 2 more. Nothing, I said, the lie tasting like copper on my tongue. Just thinking. I turned around, scanning the campsite again. 3 tents. Only 3. The same 3 we'd been pitching and striking for the past 4 days as we made our way deeper into the wilderness. The same 3 that had sheltered us through nights of rain and wind that spoke in voices just beyond understanding. But I had seen 5, and heard singing. When we planned this trip, 4 friends in their 30s desperate to reconnect with each other and something primal in themselves. The Highland wilderness seemed the perfect place. Remote, demanding, ancient.
No cellular reception.
No nearby towns. Just us, the mountains, and whatever ghosts Scotland's oldest forests might still harbor. None of us were from here originally. Lachlan was the closest thing to a local, having moved to Edinburgh from Boston 15 years ago. He had an obsession with Scottish folklore that bordered on academic. The night we arrived in Aviemore before heading into the backcountry, he'd gotten properly drunk at a small pub and regaled us with tales of each glen and mountain we'd be passing through. The Cairngorms, he'd said, voice low and reverent, aren't just mountains. They're older than most of Europe's ranges. They were worn down by ice ages that came and went before humans ever set foot here. The locals say they're alive, in their way. Mira had laughed at that. Alive how? Like, sentient. Lachlan had shrugged, a strange half-smile on his face. Not alive like you or me. Alive like time itself. They watch. They remember. He trailed off then, distracted by something outside the window. When he finally continued, his tone had changed. Anyway, you're going to love it. The most beautiful place I've ever been. It was beautiful in a way that got under your skin. Harsh and spare and indifferent to our presence. We'd been hiking for 4 days now, our planned route taking us through remote valleys almost never visited by tourists. Each night, we made camp in clearings that felt both inviting and wrong, like a door left conspicuously ajar. And each morning, I'd wake with the sensation that I'd been speaking to someone in my dreams, someone with my voice, but not my thoughts. That night after dinner, as we sat around our small fire, I finally mentioned what I'd seen. Earlier today, I started, my voice sounding foreign to my own ears. I thought I saw extra tents, 2 more than we have. The firelight cast strange, fluid shadows across my friends' faces. For a moment, no one spoke. What color? Neve asked suddenly. Her expression was carefully blank. Green, dark green, like ours, but older somehow. Lachlan cleared his throat. Ian's been reading too many ghost stories, he said, but his laugh was hollow. This area plays tricks on you. The mist, the light. There wasn't any mist when I saw them, I interrupted, and I heard singing, coming from one of them. Myra's hand found mine in the dark. Her fingers were ice cold. What kind of singing? I tried to recall the melody, something melancholy and ancient, but it slipped away like water through cupped hands. I don't remember, but it stopped as soon as I noticed it. Old trail hypnosis, Lachlan said firmly, happens when you're exhausted. The brain fills in gaps with weird shit. But later, as we prepared for bed, I caught him counting the tents under his breath. Once, twice, 3 times, making sure. I dreamed that night of voices in the darkness. My own voice, Myra's, Lachlan's, Neve's, all speaking in unison, reciting words in a language I'd never heard but somehow understood. They were calling to something in the mountains, something that had been sleeping for a very long time. When I woke, the tent was filled with a pulsing green light. I reached for Mira beside me, but her sleeping bag was empty, cold. I unzipped our tent with trembling hands and stepped out into the night. 5 tents. In the moonlight, they formed a perfect pentagram around our dying fire, and from one of them, one that hadn't been there when we'd gone to sleep, came the soft sound of Mira humming a tune I recognized from childhood. "Mira," I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. The humming stopped. Then, my own voice answered from inside the tent. "Ian, you see something?" The words were exactly what Mira had said to me earlier that day. The inflection, the cadence, a perfect mimicry. I stood frozen, unable to approach, unable to flee. Then all 4 tent flaps began to unzip in perfect synchronization. I stumbled backward, tripping over a guy line and falling hard onto the cold ground. The tent flaps opened wider, revealing only darkness within. A darkness deeper than the night around us. I scrambled to my feet and ran to our actual tent. Diving inside, Mira was there, sleeping peacefully. I shook her awake, whispering urgently for her to be quiet. When we emerged together moments later, there were only 3 tents once more. "You had a nightmare," she said, but her eyes darted around the clearing. "I'm not crazy," I insisted. "I saw them, and they were talking with our voices." Mira didn't argue, but she didn't believe me either. I could see it in her face. But she stayed up with me for the rest of the night, the 2 of us huddled in our tent, listening to the wind. When dawn finally came, bleeding reluctantly through the cloud cover, we emerged to find Lachlan sitting alone by the dead fire, his expression grim. "Neve's gone," he said simply. We searched for hours. Neve's sleeping bag was still in her tent, still warm as if she'd just risen. Her boots remained neatly placed outside. Her backpack with all her supplies sat untouched. It was as if she had simply evaporated into the highland air. "We need to alert mountain rescue," Mira said, her voice tight with concern. "We need to." "No signal," Lachlan cut in, holding up his phone. "We're at least 2 days from the nearest road. One of us needs to hike out and get help." "We're not splitting up," I said firmly. The thought of being separated from the others made my stomach twist. "We all go together. Now." Lachlan stared at me for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Fine. We pack up and head back the way we came. But first." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small leather pouch. From it, he withdrew a handful of coarse salt, which he began to sprinkle in a circle around our campsite. "What are you doing?" Mira asked. "Something my grandmother taught me," he replied without looking up. "Scottish tradition. Protection from—" He paused. "From the things that live in the old places." I wanted to laugh, to tell him how ridiculous he looked. Instead, I found myself helping, completing the circle where he'd stopped. Something in the air had changed. A heaviness, a watching presence. As we packed our gear, we didn't speak. The mountains loomed around us, their ancient peaks hidden in low clouds. For the first time, I understood what Lachlan had meant that night in the pub. They were watching us. They had always been watching us. We left by mid-morning, abandoning our original route in favor of the most direct path back to civilization. The drizzle had turned into a steady, soaking rain that ran in rivulets down our waterproof jackets and plastered our hair to our heads. The path grew slick with mud, forcing us to move slowly, carefully. By late afternoon, an unsettling realization dawned on me. The landmarks we'd passed on our way in, a distinctive fallen tree, a small stream crossing, a boulder field, were nowhere to be seen. Either we'd taken a wrong turn, or the landscape itself had changed. "Lachlan," I called out, my voice nearly drowned by the patter of rain. "Are you sure this is the way we came?" He stopped, consulting his map and compass with a frown. "We should have hit the river crossing by now," he admitted. "But the compass says we're heading south, just like we planned." "Could it be broken?" Mira suggested, peering over his shoulder. Compasses don't just break, he snapped, then sighed. Sorry, I don't know what's happening. Everything looks different. We pressed on until dusk rendered further travel impossible. We made camp in the shelter of a rocky overhang, too exhausted and drenched to bother with tents. As Mira worked to start a fire with what dry tinder we could salvage, I took Lachlan aside. What's going on? I demanded, keeping my voice low. We're lost, aren't we? He didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice held an edge of fear I'd never heard from him before. There are stories, he began, about people who go missing in these mountains. Not many, maybe 1 or 2 a decade. They're found days later, miles from where they should be, with no memory of how they got there. Exposure and dehydration can cause confusion, I said, clinging to rationality. Most of them report seeing extra shelters. He continued as if I hadn't spoken. Tents, bothies, cabins that weren't there before, and voices calling to them.
Familiar voices.
My mouth went dry. Why didn't you tell us this before we came? Because they're just stories, he said, but his eyes told a different tale.
Folk tales.
Like the Kelpies and the Selkies. They're not. He broke off, staring at something over my shoulder. I turned slowly. In the gathering darkness, perhaps 50 yards away, stood a tent. Green, ancient, its entrance facing us like an open mouth. That's not possible, Mira whispered. She had approached silently, the failed fire forgotten. We didn't bring the tents. They're still in our packs. As if in answer, a voice drifted from the tent. Neve's voice, light and musical. Guys, where are you? I'm freezing out here. We didn't approach the tent. We didn't call out to the thing wearing Neve's voice. Instead, we huddled together under the overhang, our backs to the stone, watching the green tent through the curtain of rain. Sometimes it seemed to move, to breathe, though there was no wind. What do they want? Mira whispered after hours of tense silence. Lachlan's face was a pale oval in the darkness. According to the stories, companions, vessels. For what? I asked, though I feared I already knew. For the old ones, the things that walked these mountains before humans. Things that can't take physical form anymore, not on their own. Throughout the night, voices called to us from the tent. Perfect imitations of each of us, speaking words we'd said days ago, hours ago, minutes ago. By dawn, there were 3 tents arrayed before us, one for each of us. The rain had stopped. In the gray morning light, the mountains looked subtly wrong, as if their proportions had shifted overnight. Even the air felt different, thicker, charged with potential. We run, Mira said suddenly, her voice hoarse from our sleepless night. We pick a direction and we run until we find a road, a village, anything. It was a desperate plan, but it was the only one we had. We left everything except water and what food we could carry in our pockets. The ground was treacherous with mud, but fear drove us forward at a reckless pace. We ran until our lungs burned and our legs trembled. We ran until the landscape around us became unfamiliar. Jagged rocks where there should have been gentle slopes, dense stands of ancient pines where our maps showed open moorland. By midday, we collapsed in exhaustion beside a small loch that appeared on none of our maps. Its surface was perfectly still, reflecting the cloud-heavy sky like a mirror. We need to keep moving, Lachlan panted, but none of us had the strength to stand. That's when we heard it. Neve's laughter, echoing across the water. We turned as one to see her standing on the opposite shore, waving to us. Even at this distance, I could see something was wrong with her face. It seemed fluid, unfinished, like clay that hadn't fully hardened. Neve! Mira called out, starting to rise. I grabbed her arm. That's not her. How can you be sure? Her voice broke on a sob. Because I'm right here, came Neve's voice from directly behind us. We whirled around. Neve stood there, smiling, her skin pale but unmarked, her clothing dry and clean. Behind her were 3 tents, green, ancient, waiting. I've been looking everywhere for you guys, she said, her voice exactly as I remembered it, Why did you leave without me? Lachlan was the first to recover. What happened to you, Neve? Where did you go? Her smile widened a fraction too far. I followed the singing. There were people in the extra tents, Ian. Just like you saw. They've been here for a very long time, and they're so lonely. What people? I managed to ask. The original people. The ones who were here before the mountains were worn down, before the ice came and went. Her head tilted at an impossible angle. They just want to be remembered, to be spoken, to have voices again. As she spoke, her features seemed to shift subtly, like water disturbed by a breeze. For a moment, just a moment, I saw something else looking out through her eyes, something ancient and patient and hungry. Run, Lachlan whispered. We ran. What followed was a nightmare of mud and mist and voices that called to us from everywhere and nowhere. We lost Lachlan at a river crossing. One moment he was behind us, the next he was simply gone, though we could hear his voice calling from the mist, giving us contradictory directions. Mira and I pressed on, clutching each other's hands so tightly our fingers went numb. The day bled into night, and still we staggered forward, guided only by the need to keep moving. They're hurting us? Mira gasped as we climbed yet another steep slope that shouldn't have been there. Can't you feel it? They're driving us somewhere specific. I could feel it. A current in the air, a subtle pressure that nudged us along certain paths and away from others. We were being guided like cattle to slaughter. When we reached the top of the rise, we saw it. A circle of standing stones, ancient and weathered, their surfaces etched with spirals and whirls that seemed to move in the moonlight. And within the circle, 5 green tents arranged in a perfect pentagram.
No, mira Moanet.
No, we can't go there. But we had nowhere else to go. Behind us, we could hear voices, Lachlan's, Neve's, our own, calling to each other, coming closer. We have to hide, I said, pulling her down into the heather. Wait for daylight. There won't be daylight, she whispered. Not anymore. Not for us. I wanted to argue, but deep down I knew she was right. The rules had changed. We weren't in our world anymore, or perhaps this place had never been part of our world to begin with. The voices grew closer. Flashlight beams swept the heather around us. Ian? Mira? Where are you? Neve's voice called, sweet and concerned. Guys, it's okay. Lachlan's voice added. We were wrong about everything. They just want to talk to us. A third voice joined in, my own voice, though I wasn't speaking. It's amazing in here, in the tents. You can hear the mountains breathing. Myra's hand tightened around mine. Don't listen, she hissed. They're not them anymore. They're vessels. The beams of light converged on our hiding place. We could see them now, 3 figures approaching, moving with the fluid grace of underwater creatures. Their faces kept shifting between familiar features and something else, something that hurt to look at directly. Run, I told Mira. I'll distract them. Get to the road. There is no road, she said with terrible certainty. Not anymore. Before I could respond, she stood up and sprinted, not away from the standing stones, but toward them, toward the circle of tents.
Mira, no.
I screamed, chasing after her. She reached the circle before me, turning back with tears streaming down her face. It's the only way, she said. One of us has to remember. One of us has to tell the story. Then she stepped into the circle of stones. What happened next defies explanation. The air itself seemed to bend around Mira, stretching and compressing like a visual echo. Her body elongated, divided, became 5 separate silhouettes that moved in perfect unison toward the 5 tents. I heard singing then, the same melancholy tune I'd heard that first night. It came from everywhere and nowhere, from the stones, from the earth, from the very air itself. And then Mira was gone, and the 5 tents stood empty, their entrances gaping wide like hungry mouths. I ran. I ran without direction or purpose, simply away from that terrible circle. The others pursued, those things wearing my friends' faces, but they seemed content to herd me rather than catch me. I ran until I couldn't run anymore, until I collapsed on a slope that overlooked an impossible valley. a valley filled with thousands upon thousands of green tents, stretching as far as the eye could see. And in the center of it all, a single massive standing stone that pulsed with sickly green light. That's when I understood. The mountains weren't alive, they were a prison. A prison for something ancient that had been trapped here long ago. Something that could only interact with our world through vessels. Through us. I turned away from the valley of tents and kept moving, though hope had abandoned me. I walked for what felt like days, though the moon never set and the sun never rose. Always, just at the edge of my vision, I could see them following Neve, Lachlan, and now 5 identical copies of Mira, all watching me with patient, hungry eyes. When I finally found the road, a small, winding track that hadn't been on any of our maps, I nearly wept with relief. I followed it blindly, putting one foot in front of the other, until headlights appeared in the distance. The farmer who picked me up said I was over 60 miles from where we'd started our hike. When I tried to tell him about what had happened, about the tents and the voices and the thing in the mountains, he simply nodded and turned up the heat in his truck. "You're not the first," he said after a long silence. "These hills, they're old. Older than anyone knows. My friends," I started, but couldn't continue. "They'll be found," he said with certainty. "They always are. Walking out of the hills days from now, with no memory of where they've been." "But it won't be them," I whispered. He glanced at me then, his eyes reflecting the dashboard lights. "No," he agreed softly. "It won't be. They were found, just as the farmer predicted. Neve first, then Lachlan, then Mira. All of them discovered by search parties, miles apart, with no recollection of what had happened after our first night camping. The authorities called it a miracle. The newspapers ran stories about survival against the odds. Only I know the truth. I see it in their eyes sometimes. A flash of something ancient and patient, something that doesn't belong in a human face. I hear it in their voices when they speak in unison, which they do more often now. And sometimes, when they think I'm not looking, I catch them staring at the distant mountains with expressions of terrible longing. I know what they're waiting for. They're waiting for me to sleep, to let down my guard. They're waiting to take me back to those green tents in the circle of stones. But I won't go back. I haven't slept in days. And I'm writing this all down, recording every detail because someone needs to know. Someone needs to remember. Because the thing in the mountains is still there, still watching, still waiting for vessels to carry it into the world. And now it has 3. If you're reading this, and you're planning a trip to the Cairngorms, count your tents carefully. And if you ever wake to find more than you brought, don't listen to the singing. No matter how familiar the voices sound. ND. The firewood bled when we split it open. Not like sap. I know what sap looks like. I grew up in rural Vermont and spent my childhood watching my father split cords for winter. Pine bleeds amber. Maple runs clear and sweet. What came out of that wood was thick and dark, almost black in the fading daylight, with a coppery smell that hung in the cool mountain air like a warning. "What the hell?" Dave muttered, pulling his axe from the log. The blade came away smeared with something that looked disturbingly like old blood. He rubbed his fingers over it, then sniffed and made a face. "That's weird. I should have known then. Should have gathered our things, gotten back in the car, and driven straight out of those mountains. But I didn't. 4 days into our week-long Appalachian Trail hike, we were too committed, too deep, and frankly too stubborn to turn back over something as trivial as strange-looking wood. We'd chosen a clearing about 50 yards from an unmarked trail off Highway 19, deep in the hills of western North Carolina. It wasn't an official campsite, more of a flat patch of ground where others had clearly camped before us. A small fire pit of blackened stones sat in the center, ringed by a few logs presumably dragged there as seating. The earth inside the pit was charred but clean. Someone had been fastidious about not leaving trash. The deadfall we'd collected had seemed ordinary enough, mostly oak and hickory, bone-dry and perfect for burning, until Dave split that first piece and it bled. "Maybe it's just some kind of fungus," Amy suggested, dropping her bundle of kindling beside the pit. She'd been quiet most of the day, distracted by something she wouldn't name. Now she leaned in to examine the log, her dark hair falling forward around her face. I read about this parasite that turns ants into zombies. Maybe it's something like that. Thanks for that mental image, I said, arranging rocks around the pit's edge. Zombie trees. Mike, who had spent the last half hour setting up his tent with military precision, wandered over. What's up? Dave pointed to the split log. Check it out. Bleeding wood. Mike squinted at it, then shrugged. Probably just wet inside. These mountains are always damp. But it hadn't rained in days. And the wood we'd gathered was dry, almost brittle, perfect for burning. Dave tossed the split log onto the pile we'd collected and reached for another. This one came apart more easily, cleaving along natural grain lines. Inside was more of the dark substance, thicker now, pooling in the wooden grooves before dripping onto the ground. Okay, this is getting gross, Amy said, backing away slightly. But we need a fire, Dave insisted. Temperature's going to drop into the low 40s tonight. I glanced at the sky. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the clouds in violent shades of crimson that seemed to seep into the surrounding forest. Shadows stretched across our campsite, long and thin like grasping fingers. Maybe we can find different wood, I suggested. Mike shook his head. It's getting dark. Let's just use what we have. If it burns, it burns. I didn't like it, but I was outvoted. We arranged the strange wood in the pit, pretending not to notice how the dark substance stained our hands and smelled increasingly metallic as it dried. By the time we got the fire going, twilight had faded to true darkness, and the flames cast our shadows in wild, dancing patterns against the surrounding trees. That's when I first noticed the silence. The woods should have been alive with night sounds. Crickets chirping, frogs calling, the occasional hoot of an owl. Instead, there was nothing but the crack and pop of our fire and the whisper of wind through leaves. It's quiet, I said, suddenly uneasy. Amy nodded, hugging her knees to her chest. Too quiet. Oh, come on. Dave chuckled, but it sounded forced. Next you'll be saying, I've got a bad feeling about this. Mike just stared into the flames, hypnotized by their dance. The fire burned oddly. Too bright, almost white at its core, with flickering red-black edges that seemed to curl and twist into shapes that didn't make sense to my eye. Did anybody check if we're allowed to have fires here? Amy asked suddenly. Dave shrugged. It's not a designated campsite. No signs saying we can't. Someone's built fires here before? I pointed out, gesturing to the established pit. Yeah, but... Amy trailed off, looking uncomfortable. I don't know. Something feels off. The flames suddenly leapt higher, as if in response to her words. A shower of sparks spiraled upward, briefly illuminating the canopy of leaves above us. For a moment, I thought I saw something moving in the trees, a shadow darker than the surrounding night. Did you see that? I asked, but no one responded. The sparks settled, and the fire returned to its strange, intense burning. The heat it gave off seemed disproportionate to its size, forcing us to scoot our makeshift seats farther back. You know, Mike said suddenly, his voice oddly flat, I heard a story about these mountains once. We all turned to look at him. Mike wasn't the storytelling type. In fact, this was the most he'd spoken all evening. What kind of story? Dave prompted when Mike didn't continue. Mike's eyes reflected the firelight, making them look hollow. About trees. Special trees. Special how? I asked, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. Hanging trees, Mike said quietly. From the old days, they used to mark them. Amy shifted uncomfortably. Mark them how? Carvings. Symbols. Mike's voice had taken on a strange cadence, almost as if he were reciting something memorized. So people would know their purpose. That's dark, Dave said, trying to laugh it off. Where'd you hear that? Mike didn't answer. He continued staring into the flames, which had begun to take on a reddish tinge. The wood in the pit seemed to be collapsing in on itself, creating strange hollows and chambers that glowed from within. I don't like this fire, Amy said abruptly, standing up. I think we should put it out. Don't be ridiculous, Dave replied. It's fine. Just burning weird because of whatever's in the wood. But I agreed with Amy. There was something wrong about the way the fire moved, the way it seemed almost sentient in its writhing and twisting. And the smell, what had started as a metallic odor had transformed into something richer, earthier, and somehow deeply wrong. I was about to stand up when I noticed the first face in the flames. It wasn't clear at first, just a suggestion of features, a hollow where eyes might be, a protrusion that resembled a nose. But as I stared, unable to look away, it solidified. A face of fire and shadow, mouth open in what might have been agony or ecstasy. Then it was gone, consumed by the changing shape of the flames. I blinked, telling myself it was just pareidolia, the human tendency to see faces in random patterns. Did you see that? Amy whispered beside me. My blood went cold. See what? In the fire. I thought I saw. She trailed off, shaking her head. Never mind. It's nothing. But it wasn't nothing. Because now there were more faces forming in the flames. Different faces, some young, some old, some barely human. They emerged from the burning with like memories taking shape, lingered for a heartbeat, then dissolved back into fire. I looked at Dave and Mike to see if they were witnessing the same hallucination, but they seemed transfixed by the flames, unmoving. Mike's lips were moving slightly, as if he were whispering something to himself. Guys, I said, my voice cracking. Maybe we should call it a night. No response. The fire popped loudly, sending another shower of sparks upward. This time, I definitely saw something move in the trees. A large, elongated shape that didn't belong among the branches. Dave! I reached out to touch his shoulder. His skin felt ice-cold despite the heat of the fire. Dave! He turned slowly, and I recoiled. His eyes were blank, reflecting nothing but firelight, as if he weren't really seeing me at all. They're speaking, he said dreamily. Who's speaking? I demanded, panic rising in my throat. The ones who were hanged. He turned back to the fire. They're in the wood. Amy grabbed my arm, her fingers digging painfully into my flesh. We need to leave. Now. I nodded, but as I tried to stand, a wave of dizziness washed over me. The air around the fire seemed to waver and distort, like heat rising from asphalt on a summer day. The faces in the flames were becoming more distinct, more numerous. Dozens of them now, all with expressions of terrible pain. And I could hear them, not with my ears, but somehow inside my head. A chorus of distant, tortured voices that seemed to emanate from the burning wood itself. What did you do? They seemed to ask. What did you do to us? I didn't do anything, I whispered, though I knew they couldn't hear me. These were echoes, memories trapped in the wood. But memories of what? Amy was pulling on my arm again, more insistently now. Jason, please. Something's wrong with Mike. I tore my gaze away from the fire to look at Mike. He was standing now, swaying slightly, his head tilted at an unnatural angle. His neck seemed too long, somehow stretched as if he were hanging. Mike! I called, rising unsteadily to my feet. Mike, what are you doing? Mike didn't respond. Instead, he took a step toward the fire, then another. The flames leapt higher as he approached, eager, hungry. Dave stood too, moving with the same dreamy slowness. They need to show us, he murmured. Show us what? Amy cried, her voice high with fear. What happened here? Dave replied, as if it were obvious. What's still happening? I grabbed Dave's arm, trying to hold him back, but he shook me off with surprising strength. Both he and Mike were now standing at the edge of the fire pit, gazing down into the flames with rapt attention. The fire had changed again. The wood no longer looked like wood. It had transformed into something else, something that made my mind shy away from identifying it. The flames seemed to lick up around forms that might have been limbs, might have been branches. And the smell, God, the smell, no longer metallic or earthy, but the unmistakable stench of burning flesh. We have to put it out, I said, looking around frantically for our water bottles. Amy was ahead of me, already unscrewing her canteen. She stepped forward and threw the water onto the fire, or tried to. The liquid arced through the air but seemed to evaporate before it reached the flames, turning to steam that twisted into shapes that looked disturbingly like writhing bodies. "What the fuck?" she gasped, backing away. The fire roared higher, as if angered by our attempt to extinguish it. Dave and Mike stood transfixed, their features illuminated by the unnatural light. Something dark was trickling from their nostrils. Not blood, but the same black substance we'd found inside the wood. "Mike! Dave!" I shouted, desperate now. "Get away from the fire!" Neither responded. Instead, they simultaneously reached out, extending their hands toward the flames. Before I could stop them, they plunged their palms directly into the fire. I expected screams, the smell of burning skin. Instead, there was just a soft sighing sound, like wind through dry grass. The flames seemed to crawl up their arms, enveloping them without burning, transforming them. Their skin took on the texture of rough bark, their fingers elongating into twisting branches. Amy screamed beside me, the sound piercing the unnatural silence of the forest. It seemed to break whatever spell had fallen over the clearing. The flames suddenly contracted, pulling inward with such force that Dave and Mike were yanked forward, off their feet, into the heart of the fire. There was no time to react, no time to save them. One moment they were standing at the edge of the pit, and the next they were gone, consumed by flames that now burned a deep arterial red. Amy's scream cut off abruptly as she turned and ran, disappearing into the darkness beyond our campsite. I stood frozen, unable to process what I'd just witnessed. The fire continued to burn, but quieter now, almost contemplative. The faces were gone from the flames, replaced by a stillness that felt like satiation. I knew I should run after Amy, but some terrible curiosity kept me rooted to the spot. I needed to understand what had just happened, what we'd stumbled into. Slowly, carefully, I approached the fire pit. The flames had died down to embers, glowing dully in the darkness. Of Dave and Mike, there was no sign. No bodies, no bones, not even ash that might have once been human. Instead, growing from the center of the pit, was a small sapling, no more than a foot tall, with delicate branches that twisted in ways that plants shouldn't twist. As I watched, it continued to grow, adding inches before my eyes, its bark forming patterns that looked disturbingly like screaming faces. I backed away, finally understanding. We hadn't just burned wood from hanging trees. We'd reconstituted them, restored them, brought back whatever ancient evil they contained. And now that evil had taken Dave and Mike and was remaking itself, growing stronger. A twig snapped behind me, and I whirled around, expecting to see Amy returning. Instead, standing at the edge of the clearing was an old man, so gaunt his skin seemed stretched over his bones like paper. The firelight cast deep shadows in the hollows of his eyes and cheeks, making him look almost skeletal. "You shouldn't have lit that fire, son," he said, his voice like dry leaves rustling. "Not with that wood. Who are you?" I managed to ask, though my mouth was so dry the words barely emerged. "Caretaker, you might say," he replied, not moving from the edge of the darkness. "Been watching these woods for 50 years, making sure folks don't disturb what's buried here." "Buried?" He nodded toward the fire pit, where the sapling continued its unnatural growth. "Not all victims get a proper grave. Sometimes they get a tree instead." I felt sick. "The hanging trees. That's right." The old man's gaze was steady, accusing. "Except they weren't for hanging, not really. Binding is more like it. Binding spirits to wood." "Binding who?" "Those who knew too much. Those who wouldn't forget. Those who wouldn't obey." He took a step closer, and I noticed his feet made no sound on the forest floor. Every generation, the ritual needs renewing. The trees need feeding. The sapling in the fire pit had grown to waist height now, its branches reaching out like arms, like fingers seeking something or someone to grasp. "My friends," I whispered. "What happened to them?" "They fed the trees," the old man said simply. "But the ritual isn't complete yet." I didn't wait to hear more. I turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush, branches whipping at my face and arms. Behind me, I thought I heard laughter. Not just the old man's, but many voices, all blending together into a cacophony that seemed to come from the trees themselves. I ran without direction, without thought, driven only by blind panic. I don't know how long I fled through the darkness before I heard Amy's voice calling my name. I found her huddled beneath an outcropping of rock, shivering despite the unseasonable warmth of the night. When she saw me, she broke down in tears of relief. "I thought they got you too," she sobbed as I held her. "I saw what happened to Dave and Mike. They just dissolved." "I know," I said, stroking her hair. "I know." We stayed there until dawn, too terrified to move, listening to the sounds that echoed through the forest. Sounds that might have been wind in the leaves, or might have been whispers of those who had been bound to the trees. When the first gray light of morning filtered through the canopy, we made our way cautiously back to the campsite, hoping to retrieve our packs and phones before fleeing these cursed mountains forever. The clearing was empty. No tents, no backpacks, no sign that anyone had camped there at all. The fire pit was gone too, replaced by undisturbed earth. And where it had been, stretching toward the lightning sky, stood a massive oak that looked centuries old, its trunk carved with symbols I didn't recognize but instinctively feared. Carved, too, were 4 sets of initials: DT, MK, AS, and JR, the last being my own. Amy saw them too. She reached out and traced the letters with trembling fingers. "Jason," she whispered, "that's not possible. This tree would have taken decades to grow." But we both knew it had grown overnight, just as we both knew, without being able to explain how, that Dave and Mike were in that tree now, part of it bound to it. Amy's initials were there too, and mine. "We need to leave," I said, grabbing her hand. "Now." We ran again, this time following what looked like a game trail, desperate to find our way back to civilization. The forest seemed to fight us, branches reaching down to tangle in our hair, roots rising up to trip our feet. Twice we thought we'd found the highway, only to discover we'd somehow circled back to the ancient oak. It was on our 3rd attempt that we encountered the old man again. He stood in our path, looking less substantial in the daylight, almost transparent around the edges. "You can't leave," he said, not unkindly. "You're part of it now. You fed the trees." "We didn't feed anything," Amy spat, her fear turning to anger. "Your trees took our friends." The old man shook his head sadly. "Not my trees, not my ritual. I'm just the caretaker." He gestured around us. "This land remembers what happened here. The massacres, the blood sacrifices. Long before my people came, long before yours. The trees remember, and the trees must be fed." "We're leaving," I said firmly, pulling Amy past him. "And we're sending people back. People who will cut down your damn trees." The old man laughed, a sound like breaking branches. "Many have tried. The forest always wins." We pushed past him, running again, no longer caring about direction, just needing to put distance between ourselves and that terrible oak. Somehow, I still don't understand how we found the highway an hour later. A trucker stopped for us, taking us to the nearest town despite our wild appearance and wilder story. The authorities didn't believe us, of course. They sent search parties looking for Dave and Mike, but found nothing. No campsite, no fire pit, no ancient oak carved with our initials. Just dense forest, undisturbed. Eventually, they suggested that our friends had simply wandered off, that we had become separated in the vast wilderness of the Appalachian Mountains. They looked at us with pity and suspicion, clearly wondering if we had done something to Dave and Mike, or if we were suffering from some shared delusion. Amy and I stuck to our story, even when doing so meant psychological evaluations and police interrogations. We told the truth again and again until we were hoarse from repeating it. No one believed us. 3 months later, Amy disappeared from her apartment. Police found no signs of forced entry, no evidence of foul play, just an empty room and a small sapling growing in a pot on her windowsill. A sapling that hadn't been there the day before, according to her roommate. I tried to warn them about the sapling, begged them to destroy it, but they dismissed my ravings as the product of guilt and trauma. Now I'm hiding, moving from place to place, never staying anywhere long enough for roots to find me. Because I know they're looking for me, the trees, the forest, whatever ancient hunger dwells in those mountains. Sometimes at night, I dream of the oak, of 4 sets of initials carved into ancient bark. 3 of them are deep and dark, cut into the heart of the wood. Mine is still shallow, unfinished, waiting. And sometimes, when I wake in the darkness, I swear I can smell with smoke and something darker beneath it. Something rich and coppery and terribly, terribly wrong. I know what's coming for me. I know that someday, no matter how far I run, I'll wake to find a sapling growing beside my bed, its branches reaching for me with unnatural hunger. The forest remembers. The trees need feeding, and I am already carved into their memory. I saw him across the fire, sharpening a knife, but he died 2 days earlier. The firelight caught the edge of the blade, orange sparks dancing along steel as Dmitri worked the whetstone with practiced strokes. His hands moved with the same methodical precision I'd admired since we began our trek through the Stanovoy Range. For days ago, those same hands had prepared our dried fish with expert cuts. 3 days ago, they'd helped pitch our tents against the bitter Siberian wind. 2 days ago, they'd turned blue under ice-crusted fingernails as we'd lowered his body into a makeshift grave beneath a twisted larch tree. Yet here he sat, across our campfire, eyes focused on his work as though nothing had happened. As though his heart hadn't stopped beating after he'd slipped into a ravine and shattered his skull against ancient stone. Nobody else seemed concerned. Yulia passed him a tin cup of tea, her fingers briefly touching his. Mikhail asked him about tomorrow's route while tracing lines on our wrinkled topographical map. Anya hummed softly, mending a tear in her glove, occasionally glancing up to nod at something Dmitri said. Couldn't breathe. My lungs refused to work as panic clawed up my throat. "Are you feeling well, Anton?" Anya asked, finally noticing my frozen posture. "You look as though you've seen a ghost." Dmitri looked up then, his eyes catching mine across the flames. The firelight reflected in them strangely, twin orange dots floating in darkness. He smiled. I remembered digging frozen earth with a camping shovel until my hands blistered. The sickening weight of his body as we'd wrapped it in a tarp, the way his head had lolled at an impossible angle. "I need air," I managed, stumbling away from the fire. Nobody followed me. The darkness of the Siberian forest enveloped me like a shroud as I staggered between twisted tree trunks. The air was bitter cold, each breath painful in my lungs. I pressed my back against rough bark and tried to make sense of what I'd seen. Exhaustion, altitude sickness, grief-induced hallucination. That's all it was. That's all it could be. We'd set out from Yakutsk 16 days earlier, 5 friends from Moscow University's geology department, on what was meant to be a challenging but straightforward expedition to collect mineral samples from a remote section of the Stanovoy Range. Dmitri had family connections in the area. His grandfather had worked in the old Soviet mining operations. He knew which permits to secure, which local officials to bribe, which guides to hire for the first leg of our journey. "This place isn't like European Russia," he'd warned us before we left. "The wilderness here has teeth. The locals respect it. We should too." I remembered his words as I leaned against the tree, trying to steady my breathing. The forest around me seemed to inhale and exhale in perfect counterpoint to my own ragged breaths. Wind sifted through the needles overhead, creating a whispered conversation just beyond comprehension. When I pushed away from the tree, my hand came away sticky. Not with sap, but with something darker, viscous. It smelled of copper and salt. In the dim moonlight filtering through the canopy, it looked black on my fingertips. Blood, fresh blood, oozing from the tree bark. I stumbled back toward the campfire, wiping my hand frantically against my parka. The light from our camp beckoned through the trees, and I fixed my eyes on it, refusing to look at the shadows that seemed to move with deliberate purpose in my peripheral vision. When I burst back into the circle of firelight, everyone looked up, startled by my sudden reappearance. Everyone except Dmitri. His place by the fire was empty, his knife and whetstone placed neatly on his rolled sleeping bag. "Where did he go?" I demanded, my voice cracking. Mikhail frowned. Who? Dmitri. He was just here, sharpening his knife. The silence that followed crushed me like a physical weight. Yulia and Anya exchanged worried glances. Mikhail stood and placed a steady hand on my shoulder. Anton, he said gently, Dmitri died 2 days ago. We buried him together, remember? Under the larch tree with the split trunk. But he was here, I insisted. You gave him tea, Yulia. You asked him about the route, Mikhail. They stared at me with identical expressions of concern, and something else, fear. Not of Dmitri, but of me, of what was happening to my mind. I let Mikhail guide me to my sleeping bag. I accepted the pills Anya pressed into my palm, mild sedatives from our medical kit. I swallowed them dry and lay down, facing away from the fire, away from their worried whispers. As sleep pulled me under, I heard Dmitri's voice, close to my ear. The forest has teeth, Anton, and it's hungry. Morning brought no clarity. I woke to find the others already breaking camp, moving with the efficient haste of people eager to leave a place behind. No one mentioned my episode from the night before. We're heading back, Mikhail announced when he saw I was awake. Anya's satellite phone picked up a weather alert. Major storm system moving in from the north. We need to reach the ranger station before it hits. A logical explanation, a necessary precaution, but I saw the sidelong glances they gave me when they thought I wasn't looking. We hiked in silence through a forest that seemed to press closer with each passing hour. The trees here were ancient, gnarled things, their trunks twisted into shapes that suggested suffering. Lichen hung from branches like ragged gray beards. The ground was a carpet of needles that muffled our footsteps, making it feel as though we moved through a space designed to absorb sound. By midday, the sky had darkened to the color of a fresh bruise. The air grew dense with moisture, heavy in our lungs. We stopped to consult our maps, huddled together against the dropping temperature. We won't make the ranger station before dark, Yulia said, tracing our position with a fingertip that trembled slightly. We should set up camp while we still have light. No one argued. We'd learned during our time in the Stanovoy that darkness fell with startling swiftness, as though someone had simply extinguished the sun. We found a small clearing beside a stream that cut through the forest like a black ribbon. As the others set up the tents, I volunteered to collect water. Anything to escape the weight of their concerned gazes. The stream ran cold and clear over smooth stones. I knelt on the bank and dipped our filtration bottle into the current. The water swirled around my hands, numbing them within seconds. As I waited for the bottle to fill, I noticed something caught between 2 rocks downstream. A flash of unnatural color against the monotonous grays and browns of the forest floor. I secured the filled water bottle and moved closer to investigate. It was fabric, bright blue synthetic material snagged on the rocks. I reached down and pulled it free. It was a glove, a climbing glove, identical to the ones Dmitri had worn. My heart hammered against my ribs as I turned it over in my hands. The interior was stained dark with what could only be blood, now dried to a rusty brown. And there, stitched into the wristband in neat Cyrillic letters, D. Volkov, Dmitri's glove, the one missing from his left hand when we'd buried him. I should have shown it to the others, should have called them over, presented this evidence that I wasn't losing my mind. But something stopped me, a cold certainty that they wouldn't see what I saw, that the glove would transform in their presence, become something ordinary and explicable. So I tucked it into my pocket and returned to camp with our water, saying nothing. That night, as we huddled in our tents against the first probing fingers of the storm, I lay awake listening to the wind. It didn't howl or moan as wind should. Instead, it seemed to articulate almost words, a language just beyond comprehension. The nylon walls of our tent rippled and snapped, creating shapes that reminded me of faces contorted in silent screams. Sometime after midnight, I heard footsteps circling our tent. Slow, deliberate steps that pressed into the earth with unnatural weight. They completed one circuit, then began another, then a third. Beside me, Mikhail slept on, untroubled by the sound. When I could bear it no longer, I unzipped the tent flap and peered out into darkness so complete it seemed to press against my eyeballs. The footsteps had stopped. "Who's there?" I whispered. A match flared 10 feet away, illuminating Dimitri's face for just an instant before darkness swallowed him again. But that brief glimpse was enough to see that something was wrong with his features. They seemed fluid, as though the skin of his face hadn't quite settled onto the bone beneath. I jerked back inside the tent and sealed the flap with trembling fingers. Cold sweat drenched my sleeping bag despite the freezing air. I pressed my fist against my mouth to keep from screaming, biting down on my knuckles until I tasted blood. Outside, the footsteps resumed their patient circuit of our tent. Morning revealed a world transformed. The storm had arrived during the night, not with rain or snow, but with fog, a dense, milky vapor that reduced visibility to arm's length and muffled all sound. It clung to our clothing as we broke camp, leaving beads of moisture that weren't quite water. They were too viscous, too reluctant to evaporate. "Stay close," Mikhail instructed as we prepared to move out. Easy to get separated in weather like this. We formed a human chain, each person keeping physical contact with the one ahead and behind. Mikhail led, compass in hand. I took position at the rear, partly because I didn't trust myself to follow the path, partly because I couldn't shake the sensation that something was following us. Something that wore Dimitri's face but wasn't Dimitri. We'd been hiking for perhaps an hour when Yulia suddenly stopped, causing our little chain to accordion into itself. "Listen," she said, holding up one hand. We froze, straining our ears against the muffling effect of the fog. First, I heard nothing. Then, distantly, the sound reached us, voices calling to one another. Human voices. "Other hikers?" Anya suggested, but her tone made it a question. "Or the ranger patrol," Mikhail said with obvious relief. "They must have come out looking for us after the storm warning." He cupped his hands around his mouth and shouted into the fog, "Hello! We're here." The voices stopped immediately. The silence that followed felt observant, as though the fog itself was listening. "Hello!" Mikhail called again, less certainly. No response. Just the drip of moisture from unseen trees. "We should keep moving," I said, fighting to keep my voice steady. "The ranger station can't be more than a few hours ahead if we maintain course." Mikhail nodded, and we resumed our trudge through the ghostly landscape. But now there was a new tension in our linked chain, a hyper-awareness. Every snap twig or shift of fog became cause for alarm. The voices didn't return, but twice more we stopped when someone thought they heard footsteps paralleling our course through the trees. Each time, investigation revealed nothing but more fog, more twisted trunks disappearing into gray oblivion. By mid-afternoon, the trees began to thin, and the ground sloped downward. According to our map, we were nearing the valley where the ranger station was located. Our pace quickened with renewed hope. Then Anya, directly in front of me, stopped so abruptly I collided with her back. "What's wrong?" I asked. She pointed wordlessly ahead. Through a break in the fog, I could make out a dark shape on the ground perhaps 20 feet away. As we drew closer, the shape resolved itself into a human form, curled on its side as though sleeping. It was Dimitri, not a vision or hallucination this time, but a physical body, the same body we had buried 3 days earlier, now lying in the middle of our path. His clothes were caked with grave soil. His skin had the waxy pallor of death. And yet, his chest rose and fell with shallow breaths. Yulia screamed, the sound swallowed almost instantly by the fog. Mikhail stood frozen, his face a mask of disbelief. Anya began to pray in rapid, desperate whispers. I alone approached the body, drawn by a terrible certainty. I knelt beside Dimitri and gently rolled him onto his back. His eyes fluttered open, focusing slowly on my face. "Anton," he said, his voice a dry rasp, "you have to turn back. It's using me to find you." "What is?" I whispered. "What's happening?" His hand clutched my wrist with surprising strength. "The cycle. We disturbed it when we came to the old mining site. It's been feeding there for, I don't know how long. Decades. Centuries. Feeding on what?" "Time," he said. "Memories. Reality itself creates loops, distortions, makes you experience the same moments over and over until you can't tell what's real anymore. Then it consumes the confusion, the fear. Behind me, Mikhail found his voice at last. This isn't possible. We buried him. I felt for a pulse myself. It's not really him, I said, though I wasn't sure I believed it. It can't be. Dmitri's eyes never left mine. Remember what I told you before we left? The wilderness here has teeth. Those words, the same ones I'd heard whispered in my ear the night before. A chill deeper than the Siberian cold settled into my bones. How do we stop it? I asked. You don't. His lips curved into a smile that wasn't his. Too wide. Too many teeth. You're already caught in it. His body convulsed suddenly, back arching off the ground at an impossible angle. A sound emerged from his throat. Not a human scream, but something like radio static mixed with the chattering of insects. We ran. All pretense of scientific curiosity or rational explanation abandoned, we ran blindly through the fog. Our chain dissolved as panic took hold. I heard Yulia and Anya somewhere ahead, Mikhail's heavier footfalls behind me. The ground sloped sharply downward, treacherous with loose stones and exposed roots. I don't know how long we ran. Time seemed to stretch and compress in unpredictable ways. At some point, I realized I could no longer hear the others. The fog pressed in, a living thing wrapping its tendrils around me. Each direction looked identical. Ghostly trees, indistinct shadows, ground that vanished a few feet ahead. I stopped, gasping for breath, and tried to orient myself. Without the compass Mikhail carried, I had no way to determine direction. The fog obscured the sun completely, leaving me without even that basic reference. Mikhail, I shouted. Yulia, Onyo. My voice seemed to travel no distance at all, absorbed by the fog mere feet from my lips. Something rustled in the undergrowth behind me. I whirled, heart pounding, but saw nothing. The sound came again, closer this time to my left, then my right. Whatever it was circling me. I backed against the trunk of a massive pine, trying to eliminate at least one direction of attack. The needles above me stirred, though there was no wind. Droplets of moisture fell onto my upturned face. Droplets that smelled of copper and salt. Blood. The trees were weeping blood. The forest floor shifted, needles and dead leaves parting like water as something moved beneath them. The movement circled my position once, twice, spiraling inward. Drawing closer, I fumbled for my pack, searching for anything that might serve as a weapon. My fingers closed around our geological hammer, a poor defense against whatever was hunting me, but better than nothing. The movement stopped directly in front of me. The ground bulged upward, as though something large was pushing from below. Soil and needles cascaded away as a hand broke the surface. A human hand, pale and dirt-encrusted. Then another, and another, and another. For hands, pushing upward from the same spot, fingers splayed like the legs of some monstrous spider. I ran, blind panic propelling me forward. I crashed through the forest with no thought for direction or safety. Branches whipped my face, roots caught at my feet. Several times I fell, scrambling back up with frantic energy. The fog began to thin, or perhaps my eyes had adjusted to it. I could make out shapes more clearly now, the slope of the land, the spacing of the trees. And ahead, a break in the forest. Clearing. I burst from the tree line and skidded to a halt. Before me stretched a small open space with a fire pit at its center. Around the pit sat 3 figures. Yulia, Onyo, Mikhail. Relief flooded through me. Thank God, I gasped. I thought I'd lost you all. They turned to look at me in perfect unison, their movements mechanical, like puppets controlled by the same hand. Their faces were blank, eyes reflecting the flames with the same unnatural orange dots I'd seen in Dmitri's eyes. Join us, Anton, they said in eerie chorus. The cycle is almost complete. Behind them, at the edge of the clearing, stood a figure I recognized instantly. Myself. My doppelganger watched with an expression of mingled horror and resignation. mouth moving silently as though trying to warn me of something. And beside the fire, sharpening a knife with practiced strokes, sat Dmitri. He looked up and smiled. The wilderness has teeth, Anton, and it never stops feeding. I understood then. This wasn't the first cycle. Perhaps not even the 100th. We had been caught in this loop for how long? Days? Years? Time had no meaning here. I backed away from the clearing, shaking my head.
No.
I won't join you. I won't complete the cycle. You already have, said the thing wearing Dimitri's face. It gestured toward the tree line behind me. I turned, already knowing what I would see. 3 fresh graves, marked with cairns of stacked stones, and a 4th open and waiting, the disturbed soil still moist. The cycle always ends the same way, Dmitri said, his voice now overlaid with other voices. Dozens, hundreds of them, speaking in unison. You bury your friends. You bury yourself. And then we begin again. No, I said again, but with less conviction. Memories were surfacing now, fragmentary, contradictory. How many times had I seen Dmitri across the fire, sharpening his knife? How many times had I run through the fog? How many graves had I dug with blistered hands? The forest around us seemed to lean inward, branches stretching like grasping fingers. The fog thickened again, but now it pulsed with a subtle rhythm, like the beating of an enormous heart. At the edge of my awareness, I sensed something vast and ancient watching through every drop of moisture, every needle, every grain of soil. Not malevolent exactly, just hungry, eternally, insatiably hungry. I knew then what Dmitri, the real Dmitri before the cycle began, had been trying to warn us about. The old mining operation hadn't just extracted minerals from the Stanovoy Range. It had disturbed something that had been sleeping in the mountains since before human memory. And now we were caught in its digestive system, being broken down slowly, our sense of reality dissolving as it extracted whatever psychic nourishment our terror and confusion provided. There was only one way to break the cycle. I stepped forward, toward the fire and the grotesque reunion of my friends. Toward Dmitri, still working his whetstone across the blade with hypnotic precision. I remember now, I said quietly. I know what happens next. Dmitri looked up, and for just an instant, I saw something like relief in his eyes, the real Dmitri trapped somewhere in the shell this thing was wearing. I lunged across the fire and seized the knife from his hands. Before the others could react, before the presence infesting the forest could tighten its grip, I plunged the blade into my own heart. Pain exploded through my chest, white-hot and absolute. I felt the edge grate against bone, felt my knees give way as blood poured from the wound. As I collapsed, the world around me seemed to ripple and distort, as though viewed through heat waves. The presence in the forest screamed, not with a voice, but with the creaking of 10,000 branches, the rustling of 1,000,000 needles, the shifting of soil and stone. The fog contracted violently, then exploded outward in all directions. And suddenly, I was standing at the edge of a clearing I'd never seen before. My chest was whole, the knife nowhere to be seen. The fire pit was cold, long and used. No sign of my friends, no sign of graves. Just an ordinary clearing in an ordinary Siberian forest. A rescue team found me 3 days later, wandering along the banks of a stream 20 miles from where our expedition had been scheduled to collect samples. I was severely dehydrated, hypothermic, and incoherent. They found no trace of Mikhail, Yulia, or Anya. No trace of Dmitri. The official report concluded that a sudden storm had separated our group, and that my companions had likely succumbed to exposure. Searches continued for weeks but yielded nothing. Eventually, the case was filed away as another tragedy in a wilderness known for being unforgiving. I never told the authorities what really happened. Who would believe me? Better to be thought of as the lucky survivor than as a madman. But sometimes, on cold nights when the wind sounds almost like voices, I take out the blue climbing glove I still keep locked in a drawer, the one with D. Volkov stitched into the wristband. I hold it up to the light and look at the stains on the interior, now faded to a dull brown. And I wonder if I truly broke the cycle or if I'm still caught in it, If somewhere in the Stanovoy range, around a campfire I can't see, a version of me is watching Dmitri sharpen his knife. Watching and wondering why no one else seems concerned that he died 2 days earlier. The wilderness has teeth, after all, and it never stops feeding. The end. The howling stopped the moment we screamed back. We'd been hearing it for 3 nights in a row. An undulating, quavering sound that bounced between the jagged southern Andean peaks and echoed across Lake Argentino's still surface. Each night, it started precisely at 3:17 a.m., according to Jake's fancy GPS watch. Each night, it continued for exactly 27 minutes. Each night, it grew louder, as if whatever made that sound was coming closer. Until tonight, when Marisol cupped her hands around her mouth and held back. The silence that followed was more terrifying than any sound I've ever heard. It was the silence of something suddenly aware. The silence of a predator fixing its attention. The silence of the darkness itself taking notice. "What the hell did you do that for?" I whispered, but my voice seemed abrasively loud in the perfect stillness that had fallen over our camp. The crackling fire between us had even gone quiet, the flames now barely moving as if afraid to draw attention. Marisol's smile faltered. I don't know what I thought. "It knows we're here now," Jake said, looking up from his satellite phone. He'd been trying for 2 days to get a signal, to call for early extraction from this godforsaken corner of Patagonia. We'd come here to document the region's undiscovered routes for an adventure travel magazine. Jake the photographer, Marisol our local guide, and me, the writer who'd stumbled into this assignment after my colleague broke his leg 2 days before departure. None of us were superstitious people. None of us believed in monsters or myths. But that was before the howling started. Before the local guides in El Caliphate refused to take us beyond a certain point, forcing us to find Marisol, the only guide desperate enough for money to bring us here. "It's just wind," I said, though I knew better. Wind doesn't stop the moment you call out to it. Wind doesn't maintain a schedule. Something rustled in the tree line beyond our tents, a distance that suddenly seemed terribly inadequate. The scrubby southern beech trees shivered without any breeze to move them. "Maybe we should pack up in the morning," Jake suggested. "We've got enough material." Marisol shook her head. "No trails tomorrow. Too dangerous in daylight to go back the way we came. We wait 2 days. Take the eastern path when the tide is right." "Tide? We're at a lake," I said. "Not just a lake." Marisol's voice had taken on a strange, flat quality. "The locals call it Lago del Eco Hambriento, the Lake of the Hungry Echo." "You didn't mention that before," Jake said accusingly. "You didn't ask," she replied, her eyes never leaving the tree line. "And you paid extra to come to the unmarked places." I pulled my sleeping bag tighter around my shoulders. The temperature had plummeted in the last few minutes, dropping from pleasantly cool to a bone-deep chill that had nothing to do with the actual air temperature. "What's the Hungry Echo?" I asked, though something inside me screamed not to. Before Marisol could answer, it came again, the howl. But different this time. Closer. And not from the mountains or the lake. From directly behind my tent. No more than 20 feet away. The sound was wrong in ways I couldn't articulate. It contained frequencies that human vocal cords couldn't produce, vibrating through my teeth and making my sinuses ache. But worse was what lay beneath the howl: words. Almost words. Something trying to form human speech without understanding how our mouths work. I didn't realize I was hyperventilating until Jake grabbed my arm. "Ben, breathe. Just breathe." The howl changed, modulating into something that sounded hideously like my name, stretched across a dozen syllables. "Binjay Armenian." "It shouldn't know my name," I whispered. "I never told it my name." "You answered," Marisol said simply. "I am sorry. I didn't think it was really here." "What is it?" Jake demanded, fumbling for the bear spray he kept clipped to his belt. Useless against whatever was out there, I was certain. Instead of answering, Marisol began hastily drawing something in the dirt with a stick. A circle with intricate patterns inside it that looked vaguely familiar, like something I'd seen carved into the wooden door frames of the oldest buildings in El Caliphate. "Stay inside this," she ordered. "Both of you. Now." We didn't argue. The authority in her voice brooked no resistance. As we huddled inside her crude dirt circle, the howling began again, but now it was all around us, coming from a dozen different directions at once. The impossible chorus of voices rose and fell in patterns that seemed almost mathematical in their precision. "What are they saying?" I asked, though I wasn't sure how I knew they were saying anything at all. "Not they," Marisol corrected. "It, one thing with many voices. The locals call it LK respond, the one who answers. It lives in the spaces between echoes." "That doesn't make any sense," Jake snapped, but his voice trembled. "It doesn't have to make sense to be true," Marisol replied. The howling intensified, and then, most terrifying of all, fell into perfect harmony with itself, creating a chord that couldn't exist in nature. The sound penetrated my skull, making my vision blur. I pressed my palms against my ears, but it did nothing to block the noise that seemed to bypass my eardrums entirely and vibrate directly against my brain. "What does it want?" I managed to ask through gritted teeth. Marisol looked at me with eyes that reflected the firelight in all the wrong ways, like some nocturnal animals. "What all hungry things want. To feed." "On what?" Jake asked. "On the one who answered." She turned to look at me. "On the one who answered first." I started to protest, but then remembered. The first night, when the howling started, I'd been half asleep. I'd mumbled something in response before fully waking. I'd assumed it was just Jake or Marisol talking to me, but I had answered first. And now it knew my name. The fire went out. Not gradually, not blown by a sudden gust of wind. It simply extinguished between one heartbeat and the next, plunging us into a darkness so complete I couldn't see my hand in front of my face. "Jake!" I called out, my voice embarrassingly high-pitched with fear. "Marisol!" No one answered. The darkness had texture. It brushed against my skin like cobwebs, or like the legs of impossibly large insects tasting. I swatted at nothing, my hands passing through empty air that nonetheless felt occupied. Then came light, faint, blue, and emanating from the surface of the lake. It illuminated our campsite in a ghostly glow that turned everything monochromatic and strange. Jake and Marisol were gone. The tents remained, but the sleeping bags that had been wrapped around us had vanished, along with my companions. The circle Marisol had drawn was still there, its lines now glowing with the same blue luminescence as the lake. I stood frozen within it, afraid to cross the boundary. From the lake came a sound like rushing water, though its surface remained mirror-still. The blue light intensified, focusing into a single beam that shot from the center of the water directly to where I stood. Within that beam I saw things, moving things, flowing things, bodies that weren't bodies, faces that weren't faces, all rushing toward me along that corridor of light. I closed my eyes, but the images burned through my eyelids. I saw Jake and Marisol standing waist-deep in the lake, their expressions blank, their eyes replaced by tiny points of the same blue light. Behind them stretched a chain of similar figures, men and women I didn't recognize, some in clothing so old and strange they must have died decades or even centuries ago, all standing in the same position, all staring at me with those points of blue fire where their eyes should be. The chain went back and back, each figure slightly more decayed than the one in front of it, until the ones farthest from shore were little more than skeletons with tatters of clothing hanging from bleached bones. And behind them, I won't describe what stood behind them. I can't. My mind protects me from fully remembering it, the way the body produces shock to shield itself from unbearable pain. But it was vast, it was ancient, and it was coming closer with each figure that joined the chain. My name echoed from the lake, called by dozens of voices in unison. "Benjamin, Benjamin, Benjamin." Each time they spoke, the chain of figures took one step closer to shore. Each step brought the thing behind them one step closer too. I realized with frozen horror what was happening. They were building a bridge of bodies and souls for that vast, ancient thing to cross from wherever it existed into our world. And I was to be the final stepping stone. Marisol had known. She'd brought us here intentionally. Was she a willing sacrifice, or had she hoped to substitute me instead? It didn't matter now. Soon I would be another blank-eyed figure standing in that lake, another link in that terrible chain. Unless I broke the pattern. The circle around me was weakening, the blue glow fading as the entity in the lake drew closer. I had perhaps minutes before it collapsed entirely. I recalled something my grandmother used to say, a memory so distant I hadn't thought of it in 30 years. She'd emigrated from Chile when my mother was just a child, bringing with her beliefs that my American-born father had dismissed as superstitions. Names have power, she would tell me. Never give your full name to the darkness. It can use it to climb inside. I hadn't given my full name. I hadn't spoken my middle name, Alexander, aloud since arriving in Patagonia. It was a small thing, but perhaps enough. I am Benjamin Alexander Reeves, I announced to the darkness, my voice steadier than I felt. And you do not know me. The howling faltered. The chain of figures in the lake paused their advance. You don't know my name, I continued, gaining confidence. You know only what you stole from my mind when I answered without thinking. But that's not knowing. That's just stealing. The blue light flickered. The figures rippled like reflections in disturbed water. I know what you are now, I said, though I was lying. I had no idea what the entity was, only that it seemed bound by certain rules. You can only take what's freely given. And I take back my answer. The howling transformed into a scream of rage. A sound so viscerally wrong that I fell to my knees, blood trickling from my ears. The chain of figures convulsed, thrashing in the perfectly still water that somehow remained undisturbed by their violent movements. And then they began to sink. One by one, starting from the shore and working backward, they descended beneath the surface without a ripple. Jake, Marisol, the strangers, the skeletons, until only the vast shape remained, its outline now blazing with blue fire that revealed a form both insectoid and arachnid. Yet neither, a thing of too many jointed limbs and far too many eyes. It regarded me across the water with a terrible intelligence. Next time, its voice thundered in my mind. Next time you will answer properly. The blue light vanished. The oppressive feeling of being watched receded. I was alone in the dark, kneeling in a circle of disturbed dirt that no longer glowed. I didn't move until dawn painted the eastern sky pink and orange. When light finally returned, I found myself surrounded by our intact campsite, 3 tents, sleeping bags, cooking equipment, Jake's camera gear, my notebooks, everything as it should be, except for Jake and Marisol. They were gone without a trace. I searched for hours, calling their names until my voice gave out. I found their footprints leading down to the lakeshore, stopping at the water's edge. No signs of struggle, no signs of return, just 2 sets of footprints that walked calmly into Lake Argentino and never came back. It took me 4 days to find my way back to civilization, using Marisol's maps and Jake's GPS device. 4 nights of hearing that howling start precisely at 3:17 a.m. 4 nights of forcing myself to remain silent, no matter how much I wanted to scream back at it. When I finally reached El Caliphate, I went straight to the police. They were sympathetic but unsurprised. Lake Argentino had claimed hikers before, they explained. Sometimes the currents can be treacherous. Sometimes people misjudge the depth. Sometimes the cold water induces shock. They didn't believe my story. Of course they didn't. But one officer, older than the rest, with eyes that had seen too much, pulled me aside after I'd filled out the missing persons report. "Did you answer it?" he asked quietly, glancing around to ensure his colleagues couldn't hear. I nodded, unable to speak. "Then they're not missing," he said flatly. "They're taken. And you're marked." "Marked for what?" I managed to ask. "For return." He pressed something into my palm. A small wooden disc carved with the same pattern Marisol had drawn in the dirt. "Keep this with you. Never go near water deeper than you can stand in. Never answer when your name is called after dark, no matter whose voice it seems to be." I followed his advice for 3 years now. I moved to Arizona, as far from large bodies of water as I could manage. I changed my name. I never go out after midnight. I keep the wooden disc on a cord around my neck. But last night, I woke at exactly 3:17 a.m. to the sound of howling coming from my bathroom sink. And when I turned on the light, the water in the basin was blue. I'm leaving tonight. I don't know where I'll go, but it needs to be somewhere without plumbing. Somewhere without lakes or rivers or oceans. Somewhere where water doesn't pool after rain. Because the thing from Lake Argentino has found me. And next time I might answer without thinking. Next time, I might become another link in that terrible chain stretching back into the darkness. Another stepping stone for LK Respond. The one who answers is coming, and it knows almost all of my name. I watched the stars move into a circle, like an eye, and it blinked. That's when I knew we were going to die out there in the Gobi. Not from thirst, not from exposure, but from something ancient and patient that had been waiting beneath the sand for millennia. The expedition had started 3 weeks earlier. 7 of us, all experienced in our fields. Narambator, our Mongolian guide. Dr. Ellis, the geologist. May, the astronomer. Santos, the photographer. Hoffman, our survival expert. Chun, the translator. And me, the writer, the one tasked with documenting what we found for the research journal. What a joke that seems now. As if words could ever capture what happened. The Gobi's vastness isn't like other deserts. It's not just sand. It's stone and gravel and mountains that rise from nowhere. During the day, the heat blisters your skin through your clothes. At night, the temperature plummets, and the cold seeps into your bones like death's whisper. But we were prepared for all that. What we weren't prepared for was the silence. It's a silence so complete it becomes a presence. The desert doesn't just surround you. It watches you, waiting for you to make a mistake. That's what Narambator told us on our second night. His weathered face illuminated by our campfire. The old herders say the Gobi has eyes, he said, stirring the embers with a stick. They say it remembers everyone who has ever crossed it. Ellis laughed. Good thing we're just here to study rock formations and astronomical anomalies, then. Narambator didn't smile. The anomalies are why the old ones never camp where we are going. What do you mean? May asked, suddenly interested. She'd been fixated on her tablet, reviewing the satellite data that had brought us here. Unusual magnetic readings coinciding with reported stellar aberrations visible only from this specific section of the desert. There is a place, Narambator said quietly. About 2 days' journey from here. The locals call it Newton Gazran, the Eye of the Earth. They say the stars behave strangely there. They avoid it. Well, that's exactly why we're here, Ellis said with the confidence of someone who has never had reason to doubt science. Magnetic anomalies can create all sorts of optical illusions. Narambator shrugged and said something in Mongolian that Chun didn't translate. I caught his eye across the fire, and he looked away. I should have known then. Chun had been reluctant about this expedition from the start, but the university was paying him well. Too well to voice his concerns. The land changed as we traveled deeper into the region. The gravel plains gave way to an expanse of rippling dunes broken by jagged rock formations that reminded me of decaying teeth in a giant's mouth. The air grew thicker, harder to breathe, though our instruments showed normal oxygen levels. Does it feel heavier to anyone else? Santos asked on the morning of the third day, adjusting the straps of his camera equipment. It's just the barometric pressure, Hoffman said dismissively. We're in a depression, lower elevation. But Ellis frowned at her instruments. Actually, we're at a higher elevation than yesterday. No one had an explanation, so we continued on. That night, I had the first dream. I was sinking in the sand, but it wasn't sand. It was millions of tiny, translucent eggs, each with something dark wriggling inside. I woke gasping, my sleeping bag soaked with sweat despite the desert cold. May was already awake, sitting outside her tent, staring at the sky with her telescope. Couldn't sleep, I asked, joining her. She didn't respond immediately. When she finally turned to me, her face looked pale in the starlight. The stars are wrong, she whispered. Wrong how? Just wrong. Look. She shifted aside so I could peer through her telescope. I'm not an astronomer. I couldn't tell you if a constellation was out of place. But what I saw made my skin crawl anyway. The stars seemed to shiver, like reflections in water when a stone is dropped in the center. It could be atmospheric distortion, she said, not sounding convinced. But I've never seen anything like it. The next morning, no one mentioned strange dreams or trembling stars. We packed up and moved on. The terrain grew more bizarre. Rock formations that seemed to defy gravity, sand that sparkled with an oily iridescence under the sun. This doesn't match any of the geological surveys, Ellis muttered, repeatedly checking her GPS. We should be in an area of mostly flat gravel plain with scattered low dunes. Maps can be wrong, Narambiter said. The Gobi changes, but it wasn't just the land. By midday, the air had taken on a yellowish tinge, though there was no dust storm. Our shadows stretched longer than they should have at that time of day, and they seemed to ripple at the edges, like heat mirages but more deliberate. That evening, as we set up camp, Santos approached me with his camera display. "Look at these," he said, scrolling through the day's photos. "Tell me if you see it." The landscapes looked normal at first glance. Stark desert beauty, our small convoy moving across the vastness. But when he zoomed in on one particular dune in the background of several shots, I saw it, a distortion like a heat haze but with structure. With each photo, taken minutes apart, the pattern changed, as if something was moving beneath the sand. "Could be a lens flare," I suggested without conviction. Santos shook his head. "I've been doing this for 20 years. That's not equipment error." As darkness fell, we gathered around the portable stove for dinner. The usual banter was subdued. Everyone seemed lost in their own thoughts, occasionally glancing at the deepening shadows as if expecting to see something moving there. "We should reach the primary research coordinates tomorrow," Ellis announced, trying to sound enthusiastic. "The magnetic readings are already stronger than predicted." "I don't like it here," Chin said suddenly. It was the first time he'd volunteered an opinion since we'd left base camp. "This place feels sick." "Sick," Hoffman snorted. "It's a desert, not a patient." "No, I understand," May said quietly. "There's something wrong with the air, the light. Even the stars don't want to be here." An uncomfortable silence followed. We finished eating and retreated to our tents earlier than usual, none of us wanting to acknowledge the growing sense of wrongness that surrounded us. That night, we all had dreams. I know because I heard the others crying out in their sleep. My own dreams were worse than before. Visions of stars falling like rain onto the desert, each one burrowing into the sand upon impact. Where they landed, the ground bulged and pulsed. I woke to find everyone already up, looking haggard and unrest. No one spoke as we broke camp. The air felt charged, like before a thunderstorm, but the sky remained a cloudless, unnatural yellow blue. Around midday, we crested a large dune and stopped. Before us lay a perfect circular depression in the desert floor, perhaps half a mile across. The sand within it was darker than the surrounding desert, almost black in places, and completely smooth, unnaturally so, as if polished. "The eye," Narambiter said softly. Ellis checked her instruments. "This is it, the epicenter of the magnetic anomaly." We made our way down to the edge of the depression. Up close, the black sand had a glassy quality, reflecting our faces like a dark mirror. Ellis knelt to collect samples while Hoffman set up our camp at a safe distance from the edge. May assembled her astronomical equipment, muttering to herself as she calibrated her instruments. "The readings are off the charts," Ellis called out, staring at her magnetometer. "And the mineral composition of this sand, it's not like anything I've seen before." Santos moved around the perimeter, photographing the depression from different angles. "It's too perfect," he said. "This isn't a natural formation. Maybe it's an impact crater," Hoffman suggested. "No evidence of impact trauma in the surrounding geology," Ellis replied. "And craters aren't this precise. This looks engineered." As the sun began to set, an unnatural stillness descended. Even the ever-present desert wind died completely. The air felt thick in my lungs, almost resistive, as if it didn't want to be breathed. May called us over to her equipment. "You need to see this," she said, her voice trembling slightly. On her monitor was a time-lapse of the sky from the previous night, taken from our last campsite. As we watched, the stars, typically moving in their predictable arcs across the night sky, began to drift out of position. Slowly at first, then with gathering speed, they started to spiral, as if being drawn toward a central point directly above the depression where we now stood. "That's impossible," Hoffman whispered. "It gets worse," May said, switching to a simulation. "Based on the trajectory changes, tonight they'll complete the pattern. They'll form a perfect circle." "Like an eye," Chen murmured, then said something in Mongolian that made Narambatar cross himself, though I knew he wasn't Christian. "We should go," Narambatar said firmly. "Now, while there's still light." Ellis shook her head. "We can't leave. This could be the astronomical discovery of the century. We need to document it." "Something is coming," Chen insisted. "Something is waking up." But Ellis was the expedition leader, and her decision was final. We would stay the night. As darkness fell, we gathered around our camp stove in silence. No one had much appetite. The stars appeared one by one, brighter than they should have been, pulsing slightly as if breathing. And then it began. Exactly as May had predicted, the stars started to move. Not the subtle drift of normal celestial motion, but a deliberate, coordinated shift. They were being pulled toward a central point in the sky, directly above the center of the depression. "My God," Ellis breathed. All scientific skepticism abandoned in the face of the impossible. Within an hour, they had formed an almost perfect ring. The center of the circle was utterly black. Not just an absence of stars, but a darkness that seemed to absorb light. Then the sand began to move. At first, it was just a subtle shift, ripples spreading across the dark surface of the depression like tiny waves. Then the center began to bulge upward, sand cascading down its sides as something pushed from below. "We need to go," Hoffman said, already backing toward the vehicles. No one argued this time, but before we could move, the ground beneath our feet trembled. Not like an earthquake, more like a massive muscle contracting. The bulge in the center of the depression grew larger, and as it rose, the starry circle above it contracted slightly, like a pupil adjusting to light. I watched the stars move into a circle, like an eye, and it blinked. In that moment of darkness, when the stars winked out in unison, something broke through the surface of the sand. Not sand anymore. It flowed like liquid, parting around a massive, chitinous shape that rose from the depths. In the returning starlight, I caught glimpses of jointed limbs as thick as tree trunks, a segmented body that continued to emerge with no sign of ending, and what might have been eyes, hundreds of them, glittering like wet obsidian along what I guessed was its head. Ellis was screaming something about a previously unknown arthropod species, while fumbling with her camera. Santos was already running for the vehicles. May stood transfixed, her face upturned to the sky where the star eye had now fully contracted into a tight, bright pupil focused on the thing emerging from the desert floor. The air filled with a sound. Not quite a sound, more a vibration that resonated in my teeth and bones and brain. It felt ancient and patient and hungry. I realized with sudden clarity that this wasn't a new discovery. This was why there were legends. This was why locals avoided this place. This thing had been here before, many times. It was cyclical, tied to the stars, waking only when they formed their watching eye. Narambatar grabbed my arm. "Run!" he shouted, pulling me toward the vehicles. The creature was now halfway out of the ground, its body glistening in the starlight. It towered over the depression, reaching toward the contracted circle of stars as if in supplication or greeting. The sand around the depression began to move, not falling away, but crawling, like millions of tiny insects surging toward the creature. Not sand, never sand. Eggs, just like in my dream, and they were hatching. We ran. Behind us, the vibration grew stronger, resolving into a rhythm that felt almost like language. The ground heaved beneath our feet, no longer solid but shifting, alive with tiny chittering things that emerged from what we had thought was sand. We reached the vehicles as the smaller creatures, each the size of a large tarantula but with too many legs and eyes that glowed with the same light as the stars above, swarmed over our abandoned camp. Hoffman got one jeep started while Santos and I piled into the other. May was right behind me, then Ellis, frantically clutching her sample case. Narambatar pushed Chun into our vehicle before jumping into Hoffman's. As we accelerated away, I looked back. The massive creature had emerged fully now, its body supported by dozens of articulated legs that plunged deep into the desert floor. Its head, if that's what it was, tilted toward the sky, toward the eye of stars that had summoned it. The smaller creatures flowed across the desert like water, pursuing us. But the most terrifying thing was the movement of the stars themselves. As we fled, the celestial eye began to turn, tracking our escape. Hoffman's Jeep was ahead of us when its engine suddenly cut out. Through our dusty windshield, I watched in horror as the vehicle coasted to a stop. Santos slammed on the brakes, and Ellis immediately shouted for him to keep going. "We can't leave them," May cried. "We have to." Ellis pointed behind us. The wave of smaller creatures was gaining, moving with impossible speed across the sand. Beyond them, the gigantic entity had begun to move as well, each step covering dozens of meters. Santos hesitated for only a second before pressing the accelerator again, swerving around Hoffman's stalled vehicle. As we passed, I made eye contact with Narambatar. His expression wasn't fear, it was resignation. He knew. Perhaps he had always known what waited in this forbidden place. We drove through the night, the Jeep pushed to its limits. Twice the engine sputtered, nearly failing, but each time Santos coaxed it back to life. Behind us, the horizon glowed with an unnatural light, pulsing in that same rhythmic pattern that felt like communication. By dawn, we had reached the edge of the region where the anomalies had first appeared. The sun rose on normal desert landscape, no oily sand, no impossible rock formations. We stopped only when the Jeep finally ran out of fuel, miles from the nearest settlement, but at least back in the world we knew. As we stood beside the disabled vehicle, Ellis opened her sample case. The dark sand she had collected was gone, replaced by tiny translucent eggs, each with a black speck at its center. As we watched in horror, they began to hatch. Ellis dropped the case and stomped on the squirming mass that spilled out. "We have to report this," she said, her scientific detachment finally shattered. "We have to warn." She never finished the sentence. Above us, in the clear morning sky where no stars should be visible, a single point of light appeared. Then another, and another. They were forming a circle. Santos and May died that day, along with Ellis. I escaped with Chun only because we found a cave in a nearby rock formation. A cave with ancient paintings on its walls depicting the exact creature we had seen and the eye in the sky that heralded its waking. The paintings showed it happened in cycles when certain stars aligned. They showed the creature's young spreading across the land. They showed deeper cycles, the creature returning to sleep, the young dying when the celestial eye closed, the sand covering everything until the next awakening. Chun took his own life 2 weeks after we were rescued by a nomadic herder who found us half dead from dehydration. He left a note saying he could feel the eggs inside him, waiting to hatch. I've been tested extensively. The doctors assure me there are no parasites in my system, no eggs waiting to hatch beneath my skin. But sometimes, when I look up at the night sky, I see the stars shiver slightly, as if something vast is stirring them. And in my dreams, I feel the rhythm of that almost language vibrating in my bones, calling me back to the eye of the earth. Last night, I woke to find myself standing in my backyard, staring at the sky where a few stars had begun to shift position, pulling toward a central point. I know what it means. The creature was not destroyed. It merely returned to sleep. And now, the eye is beginning to form again, seeking those who witnessed its last awakening. I'm leaving tonight for a place with no clear view of the stars, a place where I can hide from their gaze. But I know the truth now, the truth that humans weren't meant to understand. We were never at the top of the food chain. We were just lucky to evolve during a time when the older things were sleeping. And now they're waking up, one by one, as the stars align. I watched the stars move into a circle, like an eye, and it blinked. And somewhere in the depths of the Gobi Desert, something ancient blinked back. She came back from the woods without a scratch, but she didn't blink once the entire night. I've been trying to forget what happened in Borneo for 3 years now. The doctor said writing it down might help, get it out of my system. But some things don't leave. They just burrow deeper, like parasites searching for the perfect spot to nest. I led adventure tours back then, specialized in taking wealthy thrill seekers to remote destinations they could brag about at cocktail parties. After 15 years guiding trips across 5 continents, I thought I'd seen it all. The Amazon in flood season, the Sahara during a sandstorm, but nothing prepared me for what waited in the Dainam Valley. Our group was small, just 4 clients. Richard and his wife Elaine, both in their 50s with matching Patagonia everything. Then there was Dennis, a tech executive with a camera worth more than my car. And Maya, his 19-year-old daughter. The trip was his gift to her before she started college. She spent most of the flight staring into her phone, clearly unhappy about being dragged into the jungle. We also had 2 local guides, Tuan and Yari. They'd grown up in villages not far from the conservation area, knew every trail and stream. At least they thought they did. The first 3 days were standard jungle trekking. We hiked 6 hours daily, spotting orangutans, pygmy elephants, and more leeches than anyone wanted to count. The group complained about the heat, the mosquitoes, the constant dampness that crept into everything. But that's what they paid for, authentic discomfort in one of the oldest rainforests on Earth. It was on the 4th day that things began to change. We'd made camp near a small clearing, close to a stream that ran clear and cool. The kind of picturesque spot that would make great photos for the company website. Dennis had wandered off with Tuan to photograph hornbills. Richard and Elaine were napping in their tent. I was checking supplies when Yari approached me, his expression tight. "We should move camp," he said quietly. I looked around. The site was perfect. Flat ground, water nearby, good visibility. Why? Something wrong with this spot. Yari glanced toward the thick wall of trees to our east. Bad place. Orang Bunyan territory. I'd heard the local guides talk about the Orang Bunyan before, invisible people who lived in the jungle. Forest spirits. I didn't believe in ghosts, but I respected local knowledge. "What makes you think they're here?" I asked. Yari pointed to a formation of 7 mushrooms growing in a perfect circle at the edge of our camp. "That is their doorway. And listen." I held my breath. For a moment, I heard nothing but the typical jungle sounds. Birds, insects, the rustle of leaves. Then I noticed it. The absence of sound in one specific direction. A pocket of absolute silence coming from the eastern tree line, as if that section of jungle had been muted. "We'll move in the morning," I said, not wanting to alarm the clients with a sudden relocation. "One night won't hurt." Yari's expression darkened. "Your choice," he said, and walked away. I should have listened. I know that now. Maya was sitting by herself near the stream, sketching in a small notebook. She'd been quiet most of the trip, but seemed to be warming up to the jungle. I was about to check on her when I heard Dennis and Tuan returning from their photo expedition. "Got some fantastic shots," Dennis said, showing me his camera's display. "Those hornbills were practically posing. You were right about the light at this time of day." We prepared dinner as the sun set, the jungle growing louder with nocturnal life. Everyone gathered around the portable stove, eating freeze-dried meals that tasted better than they had any right to after a day of hiking. Even Maya seemed to be enjoying herself, asking Tuan questions about the medicinal plants he'd shown her earlier. "I'm going to wash up," she said after dinner, grabbing her toiletry bag and heading toward the stream. "Don't go far," Dennis called after her. "And take the flashlight." She waved the light in acknowledgement and disappeared into the gathering darkness. 20 minutes passed, then 30. "Maya's been gone a while," Dennis said, checking his watch. "The stream's right there, isn't it?" I nodded, a small knot of concern forming in my stomach. "I'll go check on her." I grabbed my headlamp and walked toward the stream. It was only about 50 yards from camp, but the jungle night made it seem much further. The beam of light carved a narrow tunnel through the darkness. "Maya!" I called. No answer. The stream gurgled softly as I approached. Maya's toiletry bag sat on a rock, her towel draped beside it, but she was nowhere to be seen. I called her name again, louder this time. Nothing but the sound of water and night insects. I rushed back to camp. Maya's not at the stream. Her things are there, but she's gone. Dennis jumped to his feet. "What do you mean, gone? Gone where?" "I don't know. We need to search the area." We organized quickly. Dennis, predictably, was frantic. We split into 3 groups, Dennis with me, Richard with Elaine, and Tuan with Yari. We had radios, flashlights, and a simple plan. Search in expanding circles from the camp, calling Maya's name every few minutes. Yari pulled me aside before we set out. "If Orang Bunyan took her," he whispered, "making noise will only drive them deeper into the forest. They'll take her with them." I didn't have time for superstitions. "Just find her, please." For 2 hours, we combed the darkness. The beams of our flashlights crisscrossed through the trees, illuminating vines, roots, insects, but no Maya. Dennis grew increasingly desperate, his calls turning hoarse. "She wouldn't just wander off," he kept saying. "She's smarter than that." I tried to keep him calm, but my own worry was mounting. People don't simply vanish in the jungle. They leave trails, disturbed vegetation, footprints. But we found nothing. When we returned to camp to regroup, Richard and Elaine were already back, shaking their heads. A minute later, Tuan's voice crackled over the radio. "We found something," he said. "East side, about 200 meters from camp." We rushed in that direction, following Tuan's periodic calls. When we reached them, both guides were standing near a massive tree, the kind with buttress roots that spread like walls across the forest floor. "Look," Yari said, pointing to the ground. Maya's notebook lay open, pages fluttering slightly in the night breeze. Beside it was a single footprint in the soft earth, unmistakably from her hiking boot. "But where does the trail lead?" Dennis asked, his voice breaking. Yari pointed to the tree itself, to a dark space between 2 of the massive roots, a space that looked unsettlingly like a doorway. "That's not possible," Dennis said. "She couldn't fit through there." But as we shined our lights on the opening, I noticed something odd. The space between the roots seemed to waver slightly, as if seen through heat rising off hot pavement. And was it my imagination, or did the opening look larger than it should? "We need more people," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "A proper search party. We should head back to the ranger station first thing in the morning." Dennis grabbed my arm, his fingers digging in painfully. "We are not leaving my daughter in this jungle overnight." I understood his fear, but searching blindly in the dark would only put more people at risk. "Dennis will set up a perimeter around camp. Lights on all night. Take shifts. She might find her way back, and we need to be here if she does." He wanted to argue, but exhaustion and fear had worn him down. We returned to camp, none of us speaking the obvious truth. People who disappear in the jungle rarely come back. We set up a watch rotation, 2 people awake at all times. I took the first shift with Tuan, while the others tried to rest. Neither of us spoke much. The jungle seemed different now, the familiar nocturnal sounds carrying new meaning. Was that just a bird call or something mimicking a bird? Around 2 a.m., during Yari and Richard's watch, we heard the shout. "She's back! She's here!" I bolted from my tent. Maya was standing at the edge of camp, exactly where we'd last seen her heading to the stream. She was completely still, staring straight ahead. No mud on her clothes, no scratches, no signs of having spent hours lost in the jungle. Dennis rushed to her, enveloping her in a hug that she didn't return. "Maya, where were you?" "We were so worried." She tilted her head slightly, as if considering the question. When she spoke, her voice was flat, almost mechanical. "I got lost. I'm sorry for worrying everyone." Dennis pulled back, studying her face in the light of the camping lantern. "Are you okay? Are you hurt?" "I'm fine," she said, still not blinking. "Just tired." Something was wrong. Even in the dim light, I could see that her eyes were different. The irises seemed larger, dark and liquid, with an odd reflective quality that caught the lamplight. "Maya, what happened out there?" I asked. She turned to me with that same mechanical movement. "Nothing happened. I got lost. Then I found my way back." Dennis, overwhelmed with relief, didn't seem to notice anything strange. "She needs rest," he said, guiding her toward their tent. "We can talk in the morning." I caught Yari's eye. He was watching Maya with an expression of pure dread. "Not her," he mouthed silently. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat outside my tent, watching the darkness, listening to the jungle. Around 4 a.m., I noticed something peculiar. The trees surrounding our camp seemed to move slightly, even though there was no wind. A slow, rhythmic motion, like breathing. When dawn finally came, I was exhausted but alert. The group gathered for breakfast, everyone except Maya, who remained in her tent. "She's still sleeping," Dennis explained. "I figured she needed the rest after whatever happened last night." Yari leaned close to me. "We need to leave," he whispered. "Now." "We will," I assured him. "As soon as everyone's ready." Dennis went to wake Maya for breakfast. A moment later, he emerged from the tent, his face pale. "She's gone again." We rushed to the tent. Her sleeping bag was empty, still warm. Her boots were there, meaning she'd left barefoot. How had she slipped past Dennis, past all of us? The search began again, this time in daylight. We found her within 20 minutes, standing in the same spot where we'd discovered her notebook the night before, between the massive buttress roots of the ancient tree. She was completely motionless, staring up into the canopy. "Maya!" Dennis approached her cautiously. She didn't respond. Her eyes remained fixed on something above. When Dennis touched her shoulder, she slowly lowered her gaze. "The trees are breathing," she said, her voice oddly melodic now. "Can't you hear them?" I strained my ears, trying to hear what she heard. There was only the normal jungle ambience. Birds, insects, leaves rustling. But then, underneath it all, I detected something else. A low, rhythmic sound, just at the edge of perception. In out, like a massive lung expanding and contracting. "We should go back to camp," I said, unable to shake the feeling that we were being watched by the forest itself. Maya turned to look at me, really look at me, for the first time since her return. Her eyes were wrong. Too dark, too large, too knowing. "They're watching us," she said, a slight smile forming. "They've been watching us since we arrived. They don't like visitors in this part of the forest." "Who, Maya?" Dennis asked, his voice cracking. "Who's watching us?" She turned back to the tree, running her hand along its bark with disturbing intimacy. "The old ones, the ones who were here first. They live inside." "Inside what?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Inside everything," she whispered. We practically dragged her back to camp. She didn't resist, but she didn't help either, moving with a strange fluidity that reminded me of how snakes slither. Breaking camp took less than an hour. No one spoke much. We just wanted to get out of there, back to the ranger station, back to anything resembling civilization. Maya sat on a log, watching us with that unblinking stare. She hadn't touched her breakfast. The return journey should have taken 6 hours. We'd follow the same trail we'd used coming in. Simple. Nothing was simple anymore. 2 hours into the hike, Tuan stopped suddenly, looking confused. "This isn't right," he said, consulting his map. "We should have reached the river crossing by now." We were in a part of the jungle none of us recognized. The trees were older, larger, with sprawling root systems that made the ground uneven. The canopy was thicker here, allowing only thin shafts of sunlight to penetrate. "Did we take a wrong turn?" Richard asked. "No," Tuan said. "We've been following the trail markers." I looked back at the path we'd traveled. The markers, small orange ribbons tied to branches, were indeed visible. But something felt off. The spacing between them seemed wrong, inconsistent. "Let me see the compass," I said to Tuan. He handed it over. The needle spun wildly, never settling on a direction.
Impossible.
We need to backtrack, I decided. Find where we went wrong. We turned around, following our own footprints. We're trying to. Somehow, the trail we just made had already been swallowed by the forest, leaves and undergrowth springing back as if we'd never passed through. Maya, who had been silent during our journey, suddenly laughed. It was a harsh sound, nothing like her normal laugh. The forest doesn't want us to leave, she said. Not yet. Dennis grabbed her shoulders. Maya, what is happening to you? What happened last night? She regarded him with those two dark eyes. I saw what lives in the trees. They showed me. What did they show you? I asked, unable to stop myself. She smiled, revealing teeth that seemed just slightly too sharp. Everything. Yuri pulled me aside, his voice urgent. She made a deal with them, the orang bunyan. They let her return, but she's not alone now. What are you saying? I hissed. Something came back with her, inside her, and it's calling its family. A chill ran through me that had nothing to do with the jungle heat. How do we get out of here? Yuri's eyes darted to Maya, then back to me. We have to leave her. That's not happening, I said firmly. Then we will all die here. The day wore on. We wandered in circles, the jungle morphing around us in subtle ways. Trees that shouldn't have been there, clearings that appeared and disappeared. The compass remained useless. The GPS showed different coordinates every time we checked. By late afternoon, panic was setting in. We had water for 3 more days, food for 5. But that assumed we could find our way out. The unspoken fear was that we never would. As dusk approached, we had no choice but to make camp again. No one wanted to stop moving, but continuing in darkness would be even more dangerous. We found a small clearing, smaller than I remembered from our maps, and set up the tents. Maya sat apart from the group, staring into the trees. She hadn't eaten all day, hadn't blinked, hadn't seemed to tire despite hours of difficult hiking. Dennis was falling apart. What happened to her? He kept asking, to anyone who would listen. What's wrong with my daughter? I had no answers for him. None that made sense, anyway. Night fell rapidly, the way it does in the jungle. One moment there's light filtering through the canopy. The next you're in absolute darkness, with only the stars visible in random patches overhead. We lit a fire, though Yari advised against it. They'll see us, he warned. Who? Richard demanded. These invisible people you keep talking about? We need light and warmth. The fire cast long shadows that danced across the clearing. I couldn't shake the feeling that the shadows moved independently of the flames, stretching toward us like curious fingers. Around midnight, Maya stood up abruptly. They're coming, she announced. Who's coming? Dennis asked, his voice barely a whisper. The old ones, she said, smiling that wrong smile. They want to meet you. And then we heard it, the sound of something moving through the jungle. Not the normal rustling of nocturnal animals. This was different. Multiple somethings, large and deliberate, circling our camp. Branches cracked, leaves rustled, but there were no animal calls, no identifiable sounds. Just movement, systematic and encroaching. Keep the fire going, I ordered, feeding it more wood. The flames leapt higher, pushing back the darkness but making the surrounding shadows deeper. Maya walked to the edge of the firelight, staring into the trees. They're curious, she said. They don't understand why you're afraid. Maya, come back by the fire, Dennis pleaded. She ignored him, continuing to stare into the darkness. Then she extended her hand, as if greeting someone invisible. Yes, she said to the empty air. I promised them. Dennis rushed forward, grabbing her arm. Maya, stop this. You're scaring everyone. She turned to face him, and in the firelight, I saw her eyes had changed completely. They were solid black now, with no visible whites or pupils, like 2 holes cut into her face. I'm not Maya anymore, she said, her voice overlaid with something older, deeper. Maya is here, but she's sleeping. She'll wake when they're finished. When who is finished? I demanded, moving closer despite every instinct telling me to run. What are you? She or the thing wearing her face smiled. We are the forest. We were here before humans gave us names. Before there were humans at all. The sounds from the jungle grew louder. The movement coming closer. Why are you doing this? Dennis cried, still clinging to his daughter's arm. What do you want? We want what we've always wanted. Not, Maya replied. To grow. To spread. You humans think you conquer the jungle, but the jungle allows you to pass through. Until it doesn't. Something emerged from the darkness behind her. A shape both familiar and wrong. It looked like a person walking upright but too tall, too thin, with limbs that bent at impossible angles. In the flickering firelight, I couldn't make out details, just an impression of something that shouldn't exist. Then another shape appeared beside it, and another, forming a semicircle at the edge of our camp.
Jesus Christ, Richard whispered.
Elaine began to pray softly. The shapes didn't enter the firelight but remained in the shadows, swaying slightly like trees in a breeze. I realized with horror that they weren't entirely solid. I could see the darkness of the jungle through their forms, as if they were partially transparent. What do they want? I asked, my voice barely functioning. Maya, or what was using Maya, turned those black eyes to me. They want to understand why you come here, why you cut down their home, why you take pictures of their children. She nodded toward Dennis's camera. They want to understand so they can better defend themselves. We're just visitors, I said, speaking to both Maya and the shapes behind her. We're not here to harm anything. Visitors? She repeated, the word sounding foreign in her mouth. Yes, that's what Maya called you too, when she begged for your lives. She made a bargain. They could use her to learn about you, and in exchange, they would let the rest of you leave. Dennis made a strangled sound. Maya did what? She offered herself. Not, Maya said. Very brave, very foolish, but they accepted. So they'll let us go? I asked, hardly daring to hope. If you leave now, without her. No, Dennis said immediately. I'm not leaving my daughter. Not Maya's expression didn't change. Then you will all join the forest. Become part of it. Like the others who wandered too deep. As if on cue, I noticed movement higher in the trees. Shapes hanging from branches, swaying gently. Human-shaped bundles wrapped in vines and moss, like cocoons. I squinted, trying to make out details in the dim light, and immediately regretted it. One of the cocoons had a face, partially visible, partially absorbed into the material surrounding it. A face locked in a silent scream. My God! I whispered. Your God has no power here, Not, Maya said. This place had gods before yours was born. The shapes at the edge of the clearing moved closer, their movements jerky and unnatural. I could see them better now, humanoid but wrong, with bark-like skin and fingers that extended into branch-like digits. Their faces were smooth, featureless except for dark hollows where eyes should be. Decide. Not, Maya commanded. Leave now or stay forever. We're taking Maya with us? I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. She smiled that terrible smile again. Maya made her choice. But if you insist. She snapped her fingers, and Maya's body collapsed, like a puppet with cut strings. Dennis caught her before she hit the ground. Maya! Maya, wake up! Her eyes fluttered open, normal eyes now, human and confused. Dad? What's happening? We're leaving, he said, helping her to her feet. Right now. The shapes in the darkness let out a sound. A collective moan that seemed to come from the forest itself. The trees around us began to sway, though there was no wind. Run, Yari said, already gathering his pack. Leave everything. Just run. We did. Grabbing only water and essential gear, we fled through the darkness. Maya seemed disoriented but moved under her own power, Dennis supporting her. The forest came alive around us. Branches reaching down, roots rising up to trip us, the very ground shifting beneath our feet. Behind us, the moaning grew louder, more insistent. The sound of pursuit. Yari led the way, no longer following any trail but running on pure instinct. The river, he kept saying. We need to reach the river. We ran for what felt like hours, stumbling through the pitch-black jungle, our headlamps bouncing wildly. The sounds of pursuit never faded, always just behind us, sometimes to the sides, occasionally ahead. Maya didn't speak, didn't seem fully conscious. Her eyes had returned to normal, but there was a vacancy to them that frightened me more than the solid black had. Just when I thought we couldn't go any further, we broke through the tree-line and found ourselves at the edge of a wide, swift-flowing river. The same river that should have been hours away from our camp. "Cross," Yari ordered, already wading in. "They won't follow over water." The current was strong, the water cold despite the tropical heat. We formed a human chain, passing Maya between us. Halfway across, she seemed to wake up fully. "What's happening?" she asked, her voice normal again. "Where are we?" "Almost safe," Dennis told her. "Just hold on." From the shoreline behind us came a sound like nothing I'd ever heard. A scream that was also a roar, filled with rage and frustration. The water around us began to churn, as if something was trying to reach up from below. "Keep moving," I shouted. "Don't stop." We reached the far shore, collapsing on the rocky beach. Looking back, I saw them. Dozens of shapes lined up along the opposite bank, their outlines flickering like bad television reception. They made no move to cross. "They can't follow," Yari confirmed, breathing hard. "Water is not their element." Maya huddled against her father, shivering despite the heat. "I don't remember," she kept saying. "I don't remember anything after going to wash up." I didn't believe her. There was something in her eyes, a flicker of knowledge quickly hidden. But I said nothing. We made it back to the ranger station 2 days later, following the river downstream. Maya recovered her strength quickly, becoming more like her old self with every passing hour. By the time we reached civilization, she was laughing again, making plans for college. Only I noticed that she never talked about what happened, never asked questions, never showed curiosity about the lost time. And sometimes, when she thought no one was watching, her eyes would drift to the forest with an expression I couldn't read. The official report blamed our ordeal on disorientation and dehydration. Mass hallucination, the authorities suggested. A common phenomenon in the deep jungle, where isolation and unfamiliar surroundings play tricks on the mind. I quit the touring business after that. Moved to Arizona, about as far from dense jungle as you can get. I keep in touch with Dennis occasionally. Maya's in graduate school now, studying botany, specializing in mycology, the study of fungi. She's doing field research in Borneo. I mentioned earlier that Maya didn't blink the entire night after she returned. That's not quite accurate. She did blink once, just before dawn. And in that brief moment when her eyes closed, I saw something move beneath her eyelids. Something that didn't belong there. I still dream about the breathing trees, about the shapes that weren't quite human, about Maya's black eyes and unnatural smile. But mostly, I dream about what she said to me as we parted ways at the airport, when no one else could hear. She leaned close, her breath warm against my ear, and whispered 7 words that still haunt me. "They're spreading, and they remember your face." Sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I find myself checking the houseplants for unusual growth patterns, and I never, ever sleep with the window open, because trees can travel if they have the right help, and some bargains last a lifetime. We buried him before sundown, but in the morning, his boots were sitting by the fire again. They were exactly as he'd left them the night before, placed neatly side by side, the leather still stained with mud from our hike up the eastern ridge. The laces were even tied in that peculiar way he always did them, right over left instead of the other way around. It was impossible, of course. We'd buried Mihai's body ourselves, Adrian and I, digging into the stony Carpathian soil until our hands bled. We'd wrapped him in the emergency blanket, laid him deep, and covered him with rocks to keep the animals away. I stared at those boots for a long time before I could bring myself to touch them. When I finally did, they were cold. Not just cool from the mountain air, but the kind of bone-deep cold that made my fingertips ache. Adrian wouldn't look at them. "Someone's fucking with us," he said, his voice tight, This isn't funny. There was no one else for miles. The Carpathian Mountains in early autumn were supposed to be beautiful. That's what the travel blogs had promised. Pristine wilderness, jagged limestone peaks, ancient forests untouched by modern development. A place where you could hike for days without seeing another human being. They weren't wrong about the last part. We'd planned this trip for over a year, 3 friends from university, all of us turning 30 within months of each other and feeling the first real press of time. Mihai was Romanian by birth but had lived in England since he was a child. This was his way of reconnecting with his roots, he'd said, showing us the real Romania, not the tourist version. The plan was to spend 2 weeks in the mountains, following trails that Mihai said his grandfather had once shown him. We had topographical maps, first aid kits, satellite phones. We weren't idiots. We thought we were prepared. My grandfather used to tell me stories about these mountains. Mihai had said our first night on the trail. The fire had burned low, and his face was little more than a silhouette against the star-splashed sky. He said the old people in his village believed the forests here were filled with entities that aren't quite human. What, like vampires? Adrian had laughed, taking another swig from his flask. Mihai hadn't laughed with him.
No.
Something older. They called them umber shadows. They said these beings could take forms that mimic humans, but they're not exact copies. Always something wrong with them. Creepy, I'd said, more to fill the silence than anything else. My grandfather had a saying, if you see yourself in these mountains, run the other way. What does that even mean? Adrian had asked. Mihai had shrugged. Just old superstitions. 3 days later, he was dead. It hadn't seemed like a dangerous descent. The trail was steep but well-marked, winding down from a ridge where we'd stopped to photograph the valley below. Mihai had gone first, stepping carefully on the loose scree. Watch your footing here, he'd called back to us. The stones slide easily. Those were his last words. A moment later, a rock shifted under his boot, and he stumbled. It should have been nothing, a momentary loss of balance, maybe a scraped knee. But there was an outcropping of jagged stone just below, invisible from where we stood, and Mihai fell directly onto it. The sound is something I'll never forget. Not a scream, but a wet, hollow thump, followed by a silence so absolute it seemed to suck the air from my lungs. By the time we reached him, blood was pooling beneath his head, dark against the pale limestone. His eyes were open, staring at nothing. The satellite phone showed no signal. We have to move him, Adrian had said, his voice breaking. We have to get help. But we both knew it was too late. The nearest village was at least 2 days' hike away. We couldn't carry Mihai's body that far, not through this terrain. So we buried him there, on the mountainside, marking the grave with a cairn of stones. And now his boots were by the fire. We should leave, Adrian said, already stuffing his sleeping bag into its compression sack. Now, today. And go where? We're at least a day from the nearest road. Longer if we're rushing. I don't care. I'm not staying here another night. I looked at Mihai's boots again. They seemed to be positioned at a slightly different angle now. The toes pointed more directly toward the tent where I'd slept. I blinked, and they were as they had been before. A trick of the light. Someone must have taken them from his pack before we buried him. I reasoned, though I knew we hadn't. We'd buried Mihai with everything he'd had with him, partly out of respect and partly because neither of us could bear to sort through his belongings. Adrian shook his head violently.
No.
No way. Then what? You think he came back for his boots? Adrian didn't answer. He just kept packing, his movements frantic. We should check, I said finally. Check what? The grave. Adrian froze mid-motion.
No.
Absolutely not. We have to know. Know what? What the fuck do you think we're going to find? That he crawled out of his grave to get his boots? That's insane. He was right, of course. It was insane. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we needed to be sure. I'm going to look, I said. You can stay here if you want. Adrian didn't stay. He followed me back up the trail, cursing under his breath the whole way. The morning sun was bright, the sky a flawless blue that seemed to mock our dread. The cairn was undisturbed. The rocks we'd piled on top of the grave were exactly as we'd left them, each one nestled against the next in a careful mound. There was no sign that anything had been moved. "See," Adrian said, relief evident in his voice. "I told you, someone's just messing with us." "Let's check under the rocks," I insisted. Adrian started to protest, then stopped. "Fine. But when we find his body exactly where we left it, we're getting the hell out of here." We worked in silence, removing the stones one by one. The soil beneath was undisturbed at first, but as we dug deeper, I noticed something. "The ground's softer here," I said, my fingers sinking into dirt that should have been packed tight. Adrian didn't respond. He was staring at something in the pit we'd excavated. It was a hand. Mihai's hand, pale and perfect, not showing any signs of the decomposition that should have already begun. But it wasn't attached to his arm. It lay there alone, a severed piece placed carefully in the center of the grave. The rest of the body was gone. Neither of us spoke as we hiked back to camp, moving faster than was safe on the treacherous trail. The sun had risen higher, but somehow the air felt colder than it had before. When we reached our campsite, the boots were gone. "We need to call for help," Adrian said, fumbling for the satellite phone. I knew it wouldn't work. We tried it after Mihai's fall, standing on the highest point we could reach, and got nothing. But I said nothing as Adrian swore at the device, wandering in circles as he tried to find a signal. While he was distracted, I examined the area where the boots had been. The ground there was different, the soil darker, almost black compared to the surrounding earth. And there was something else. A faint impression in the dirt, like a partial footprint, but not quite right. The shape was too long, the toes too widely spaced. "Adrian," I called, my voice sounding strange to my own ears. "Look at this." He ignored me, still focused on the phone. "I'm going to climb up to that ridge," he said, pointing to a rocky outcropping about a half-mile up the trail. "Maybe I can get a signal there." "I don't think that's a good idea. You have a better one? Because I'm not spending another night out here with whatever the fuck is happening." I wanted to argue, but the truth was, I didn't have a better idea, and splitting up seemed foolish. "I'll come with you," I said. Adrian nodded, relieved. He was already slinging his day pack over his shoulder. "Bring the emergency beacon. If the phone doesn't work, we'll activate it." The emergency beacon was in my tent. I ducked inside to get it, and that's when I noticed the smell. It was subtle at first, barely there. A faint, earthy odor like mushrooms after rain. But underneath was something else, something rotten. I gagged, covering my mouth. "What is it?" Adrian called from outside. I didn't answer immediately. I was staring at my sleeping bag, which was rumpled in a way I hadn't left it. And there, on the synthetic fabric, was a dark stain that hadn't been there before. It looked like mud, but it smelled like decay. Someone or something had been in my tent. "Nothing," I called back, grabbing the emergency beacon and backing out of the tent as quickly as I could. "Let's go." The climb to the ridge was harder than it looked. What had appeared to be a straightforward ascent turned out to be a maze of false trails and unstable scree. The sun was directly overhead now, but the air remained oddly cold, and a strange haze had begun to gather in the valleys below. Adrian was ahead of me, moving with the desperate energy of someone being chased. I was about 50 feet behind him when I saw it, a figure standing perfectly still in a grove of stunted pines to our right. At first, I thought it was another hiker, but as I squinted against the sun, I realized the figure wasn't quite right. It was human-shaped, yes, but somehow off in its proportions. The torso was too long, the limbs too thin, and it was watching us. "Adrian," I hissed, pointing. He turned, following my gaze, but the figure was gone. There was only the wind moving through the pines, making the branches sway. "I don't see anything," Adrian said, irritation clear in his voice. "There was someone there, watching us." "You're imagining things." "I'm not," I insisted, though part of me wished I was. "It was standing right there, just a second ago." Adrian looked uneasy now. What did it look like? How could I describe what I'd seen? It had been human enough to recognize as such, but wrong in ways that were hard to articulate. Like looking at a person's reflection in water that's been disturbed. The basic shape preserved, but the details all twisted. Like a person, but not quite, I said finally. Adrian's expression shifted from skepticism to fear. We need to move faster. He was right. We needed to get off this mountain, away from whatever was happening here. But as we continued climbing, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every few minutes, I would catch a glimpse of movement from the corner of my eye, a shadow sliding between trees, a figure just beyond a boulder. But whenever I turned to look directly, there was nothing there. The ridge, when we finally reached it, offered a spectacular view. On one side were the forested slopes we'd been climbing. On the other, a sheer drop to a valley so deep its bottom was lost in shadow. In the far distance, I could make out what might have been buildings, a village or small town, tantalizingly out of reach. Adrian immediately pulled out the satellite phone, holding it up to the clear sky. His face fell as he checked the display. Nothing, he said, the word hollow. Not even a single bar. I took out the emergency beacon. It was a simple device, one button to activate, sending our GPS coordinates to search and rescue. Once pressed, we'd have to wait for help, which could take days in this remote area. But at least someone would know where to look for us. My finger hovered over the button. Should we? Adrian nodded, but before I could press it, a sound stopped me. A voice calling from somewhere down the slope we'd just climbed. Hello? Is anyone there? It was Mihai's voice. That's not possible, Adrian whispered, his face draining of color. The voice called again, closer now. Adrian, are you there? I need help. It was perfect, the exact timbre and accent of Mihai's voice, down to the slight way he'd always stressed the second syllable of Adrian's name. We have to go, I said, grabbing Adrian's arm. Now. But Adrian seemed frozen, staring down the slope. It sounds just like him. It's not him. You know it's not him. A figure emerged from the trees below us. At this distance, it looked exactly like Mihai, his height, his build, his dark hair. It was even wearing what appeared to be his clothes, the red jacket he'd had on when he fell. There you are, the figure called, waving. I've been looking everywhere for you guys. Adrian made a small, broken sound in the back of his throat. The figure was climbing toward us now, moving with Mihai's characteristic gait, slightly bow-legged, favoring his right side from an old football injury. But something was wrong with its face. From this distance, it looked like a smudge, as if someone had taken an eraser to the specific details. Don't look at it, I hissed, pulling Adrian back. We need to go. The other way, down into the valley. But that's not. I know, but we can't go back the way we came. Not with that thing there. The descent into the valley was treacherous, a nearly vertical scramble down loose rock with few handholds. Under normal circumstances, we would never have attempted it. But these weren't normal circumstances. The voice called after us as we began our descent, still using Mihai's voice but with something else underneath now, a buzzing quality like flies. Why are you running? Don't you recognize me? It's me, Mihai, your friend. Adrian was crying as we half climbed, half slid down the slope, his breath coming in ragged gasps. I focused on finding secure footholds, on not thinking about the thing above us, on not imagining what its face might look like up close. When we were about halfway down, I made the mistake of looking back. The figure was at the top of the ridge, silhouetted against the sky. It was still shaped like Mihai, but its proportions had changed. Its arms were longer now, dangling almost to where knees should be, and its head was wrong, too large and somehow misshapen. It raised one of those too long arms and waved at us, the gesture horribly familiar. It's getting dark, it called, its voice still Mihai's but distorted, as if coming through a bad connection. You shouldn't be out here after dark. There are things in these mountains, dangerous things. And then it laughed, a sound that echoed off the valley walls and seemed to hang in the air long after it should have faded. Night was falling by the time we reached the bottom of the valley. The descent had taken hours, each step a careful negotiation with gravity that could have ended in disaster. My hands were raw from gripping rock, my knees throbbing from the impact of the steeper drops. Adrian had stopped crying, but his face had a blank, shocked quality that worried me more than the tears had. He hadn't spoken since we'd heard the thing with Mihai's voice. The valley floor was densely forested, old-growth trees that blocked what little remained of the daylight. I switched on my headlamp, and Adrian did the same. The twin beams cut through the gloom, illuminating a narrow game trail that seemed to lead roughly in the direction of the distant buildings I'd glimpsed from the ridge. "Do you think we can make it to that town?" I asked, as much to break the silence as to actually get an answer. Adrian shrugged. "Does it matter? That thing will follow us." "We don't know that." "I know," he said, his voice flat. "It won't stop until it gets what it wants." I wanted to ask what he thought it wanted, but I was afraid of the answer. Instead, I gestured to the trail. "We should keep moving while we still have some light." The forest was unnaturally quiet. No birds called, no insects chirped. The only sound was our breathing and the soft crunch of our boots on the needle-covered ground. The air smelled wrong, too. That same mushroom and decay smell I'd noticed in my tent, but stronger now, almost overwhelming. We'd been walking for perhaps an hour when Adrian suddenly stopped. "Do you hear that?" I listened. First, there was nothing. Then I heard it. A soft, rhythmic sound like footsteps, far behind us but drawing closer. "It's just an echo," I said, not believing it myself. Adrian shook his head. "It's following us. It's been following us this whole time." I turned, shining my headlamp back the way we'd come. The beam penetrated only a short distance into the darkness. "We need to move faster," I said, but Adrian was staring past me, his face a mask of terror. Too late. I turned again, and there it was, standing not 20 feet ahead of us on the trail. In the harsh light of our headlamps, I could finally see it clearly. It had Mihai's general shape, 2 arms, 2 legs, a head, but the details were all wrong. Its limbs were too long and jointed in the wrong places. Its torso was distorted, as if the internal organs had been rearranged. And its face was like looking at a reflection in a shattered mirror. The basic features were there: eyes, nose, mouth, but they were asymmetrical, shifted from their proper positions. The eyes were too far apart, the mouth too wide, and they moved independently of each other, the right eye blinking while the left remained open, the mouth stretching into a grin that extended literally from ear to ear. "Hello, friends," it said, still in Mihai's voice. "Why did you leave me behind?" Adrian made a small, whimpering sound. The thing took a step toward us, its movements fluid but somehow wrong, like a puppet being operated by someone who didn't quite understand how bodies are supposed to move. "I've been looking for you," it said. "I've been so lonely." "You're not Mihai," I said, my voice shaking. "Mihai is dead." The thing cocked its head at an impossible angle, nearly 90 degrees. "Am I? Are you sure?" Its hand reached up to its face, fingers too long and too many. 6 on each hand, I now saw. It touched its misaligned features, as if feeling them for the first time. "Something's wrong with me," it said, and for a moment, there was genuine confusion in its voice. "I don't feel right." It took another step toward us, and I stumbled backward, pulling Adrian with me. "Stay back," I warned, though I had nothing to threaten it with. "But I need your help," it said. I need to be fixed." Its face rippled then, like the surface of water disturbed by a stone. The features shifted, rearranging themselves to look more like Mihai's actual face. But the effect was worse somehow, not quite right, like a mask that didn't quite fit. "Is this better?" it asked, its voice hopeful. "Do I look more like me now?" Adrian was frozen beside me, his eyes wide with horror. The thing that wasn't Mihai looked down at its own body, seemingly noticing for the first time how wrong it was. It lifted its 2 long arms, staring at the 6-fingered hands. "Something happened to me," it said, and there was genuine distress in its voice now. "I remember falling. I remember pain, and then darkness. But then I woke up, and I was like this." It looked up at us, its face a grotesque approximation of confusion. "What am I?" it asked. I didn't have an answer. I don't think there was one. The thing took another step toward us, and this time Adrian broke. He turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush beside the trail. Adrian! I shouted, but he was already gone, swallowed by the darkness. The thing watched him go, its head tracking the movement with that same unnatural angle. Then it looked back at me. "He's afraid of me," it said, sounding sad. "Are you afraid of me too?" I was, but I nodded anyway, hoping honesty might somehow help. "Yes," I said, "I am." The thing considered this, its mismatched features shifting through several expressions too quickly to follow. "I don't want you to be afraid," it said finally. "I just want to be myself again. Can you help me?" "I don't know how," I admitted. "I think." It hesitated, seeming to struggle with the concept. "I think I need to remember what it was like. To be human. To be Mihai." Took another step toward me, and I forced myself not to run. "Can you tell me about him?" it asked. "About me? About who I was?" I don't know how long we talked, that thing and I, in the darkness of the Carpathian forest. It asked questions about Mihai, his childhood, his family, his favorite foods. It absorbed every detail I could recall, nodding as if committing them to memory. And as we talked, it changed. Subtly at first, the extra fingers receding, the limbs shortening to normal proportions. The face remained wrong, but less dramatically so, the features settling into a closer approximation of Mihai's. By the time the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees, it looked almost human, almost like my friend. "Thank you," it said, its voice now exactly Mihai's. "I remember more now. Not everything, but more." "What are you?" I asked, the question that had been burning in my mind through our strange night. Considered this, its now normal head tilting in thought. "I don't know exactly. Something that was here before humans. Something that watches. And sometimes when someone dies here violently suddenly, we try to remember them, to become them." "You're what they call Umber," I said, remembering Mihai's fireside story. "Shadows." It nodded. "That's one name for us. We've had many. What do you want?" "To understand," it said simply, "what it means to be human, what it means to die." The sun was fully up now, its light dappling through the leaves. In the daylight, the thing that looked like Mihai seemed less threatening, more solid, more real. "I can't bring you back," I said. "Not really. The real Mihai is gone." "I know," it said, a profound sadness in its voice. "But part of him lives in me now, the part you helped me remember." It looked down at itself, at the body that now appeared almost completely human. "I can't keep this form for long," it said. "It's difficult to maintain, but I wanted to say goodbye properly." It extended a hand, 5 fingers now, not 6, toward me. After a moment's hesitation, I took it. The skin was cold, but not unpleasantly so. "Will you tell Adrian?" it asked. "That I'm sorry for frightening him?" I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. "And will you take these?" it continued, reaching into the pocket of the jacket it wore. Mihai's jacket, somehow restored, pulled out a pair of boots.
Mihai's hiking boots.
"Bury them with the rest of me," it said, "where they belong." I took the boots, my hands trembling. "Goodbye," it said, and then, before my eyes, it began to change again, not growing distorted as before, but fading, becoming transparent. In seconds, it was gone, leaving me alone on the forest trail with Mihai's boots in my hands. I found Adrian hours later, huddled against a fallen log, his eyes wide and unblinking. It took days to get him to speak again, weeks before he could talk about what had happened. Even now, years later, he refuses to go camping, to be anywhere without electric lights and concrete beneath his feet. We made it to the village eventually. We told the authorities about Mihai's accident, led them to his grave. They found his remains, incomplete as they were, and sent them home to his family in England. I never told anyone about the shadow that wore my friend's shape. Who would believe me? Sometimes I'm not even sure I believe it myself. Maybe it was grief or altitude sickness, or some form of shared delusion brought on by trauma. But I kept the boots. I don't know why. I've never been able to bring myself to get rid of them, nor to wear them. They sit in the back of my closet, a reminder of something I can't quite explain. Sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind is right, I swear I can hear something moving inside them. A soft sound, like whispered words in a language I don't understand. And sometimes, when I dream, I'm back in those mountains. But in the dreams, I'm not myself. I'm something else, something watching from the trees. Something learning what it means to be human, one memory at a time. Something remembering what it's like to have a name. In those dreams, I always wake just before dawn, sitting by a campfire that's burned down to embers. And beside me are a pair of boots, placed neatly side by side, waiting for feet that will never fill them again. The dog wouldn't go near the stones, but we pitched our tents there anyway. Max, a terrier mutt with more courage than sense, had never balked at anything before. Not thunderstorms, not the neighbor's half-wild tomcat, not even the time a coyote wandered into my backyard in Boston. But there he stood at the edge of the clearing, hackles raised, refusing to move another inch toward the circle of weathered gray stones jutting from the emerald grass. "What's gotten into him?" Diane asked, dropping her pack. She pushed back a strand of copper hair that had escaped her ponytail and squinted at Max. I tugged gently on his leash. "Come on, boy." Max dug his paws into the soft earth and let out a low, continuous growl that seemed to vibrate through the ground beneath us. "It's just rocks," I said, more to myself than to him or Diane. "Probably smells a badger or something." Sean dropped his 60-liter backpack with a relieved groan. "This is the spot, all right, marked on the map. Perfect clearing in the woods, flat ground." He pulled out his water bottle and took a long drink. "We won't find better before dark." The four of us, Sean, Diane, Eric, and I had been hiking through rural Donegal for 3 days. We'd met 2 years earlier in a Facebook group for outdoor enthusiasts and discovered a shared ambition to hike Ireland's wild places. This trip had been in planning for months. Sean, our de facto leader with his Irish heritage and childhood summers spent with grandparents in Cork, had meticulously planned our route through what he called the last true wilderness in Western Europe. Eric, who'd been silently observing Max's behavior, finally spoke. "Anyone else notice the stones form a perfect circle?" I looked more carefully. 7 stones, each about waist-high, arranged with suspicious precision. They didn't look like they'd been placed by human hands. No sharp edges, no sign of cutting or shaping, but the mathematical exactness of their arrangement suggested otherwise. Nature rarely creates such perfect geometry. "It's a fairy ring," Diane said with a playful wiggle of her fingers. Sean snorted. "More likely an old sheep pen or something." Eric shook his head. "Too small for livestock." He stepped closer to the stones, running his fingers over the nearest one. "These are old. Really old." I'd finally managed to coax Max into the clearing by picking him up, all 30 pounds of trembling terrier, and carrying him past whatever invisible boundary had scared him. Once inside the circle, he seemed calmer, though he stayed unusually close to my leg as I set up our tent. "Did you know," Eric said as he hammered in a tent stake, "that in Irish folklore, it's bad luck to disturb a fairy ring?" He had that professor tone he sometimes slipped into, the same tone he used when explaining the scientific names of plants we passed or the geological history of the landscape. Eric taught environmental science at a community college in Vermont and seemed to know a little bit about everything. "Good thing we're not superstitious," Sean replied, checking his watch. "Sun's going down in about an hour. Who's cooking tonight?" "My turn," I said, rummaging through my pack for the lightweight cookware. As dusk settled over our camp, we gathered around a small fire. The spring air turned chilly with surprising speed once the sun disappeared behind the hills. Stars emerged in the darkening sky, more than I ever saw back home. The silence was profound. No distant traffic, no airplanes, not even the usual chorus of birds. Just the subtle crackling of our fire and our own voices. Max refused to leave the tent once I'd put him in it. He curled into a tight ball on my sleeping bag, eyes fixed on the tent opening. "So what's the plan for tomorrow?" Diane asked, accepting a tin mug of hot tea from Sean. "We'll follow the trail northwest, toward the coast," Sean said. "Should reach the cliffs by mid-afternoon if we make good time. They're supposed to be spectacular. 300-foot drops straight to the Atlantic." Eric pulled out a topographical map, tracing our planned route with his finger. "We're here," he said, pointing to a spot that, to my eye, looked indistinguishable from the surrounding wilderness. "There's an old village about 2 miles from here. Might be worth checking out." "Is it on our way?" Sean asked, frowning. "Slight detour, but the guidebook says it was abandoned during the famine. Stone cottages still standing. Could be interesting." "What's it called?" I asked. Eric squinted at the map in the firelight. "Clogmore." A sudden gust of wind swept through our camp, causing the fire to dance wildly. Sparks spiraled upward into the darkness. In the distance, or perhaps it was closer than it seemed, something let out a sound that might have been the cry of a fox, or might have been something else entirely. "Did you hear that?" I asked. The others nodded, but no one spoke. For a moment we all listened, but the sound didn't repeat. "I think I'll turn in," Diane finally said. "Early start tomorrow, right?" We murmured our agreement, banking the fire carefully before retreating to our tents. Sean and Eric in one, Diane and I and Max in the other. Despite my exhaustion from the day's hike, sleep came fitfully. I kept waking to sounds just at the edge of hearing. Rustling beyond the tent walls, whispers that might have been the wind, and once what sounded like laughter, high and cold. Each time I woke, Max was alert, staring at the tent wall, his body tense. Morning brought fog so thick I could barely see 10 feet beyond our campsite. The stones loomed like gray ghosts in the mist. As I crawled out of the tent, joints stiff from the hard ground, I noticed Sean sitting on his pack, looking confused. "You okay?" I asked, stretching my arms overhead. He looked up, brow furrowed. "Yeah, just, I can't find my watch." "The fancy hiking one with the altimeter?" "Yeah, had it yesterday. Can't remember taking it off." He rubbed his wrist where the watch should have been. "Weird." Eric emerged from their tent, his usual methodical self, rolling his sleeping bag with practiced efficiency. "Morning," he mumbled, heading straight for the camping stove to start coffee. Diane was last to emerge, looking oddly refreshed despite our uncomfortable night. "Sleep well?" she asked brightly. I shrugged. "Kept hearing things." "Like what?" "I don't know. Voices, maybe." Even saying it aloud made me feel foolish. Diane laughed. "Probably just the wind. Or Sean snoring." "I don't snore," Sean protested automatically. Eric handed out mugs of steaming coffee. "So, are we checking out that village I mentioned?" "What village?" Sean asked. Eric paused, mug halfway to his lips. "Clogmore, the abandoned one I showed you on the map last night." Sean's expression was blank. "You didn't mention any village." "Yes, he did," I said. "You asked if it was on our route." Sean stared at me, then at Eric. "I don't remember that at all." An uncomfortable silence fell over our group. I glanced at Diane, who shrugged. "Must not have been paying attention," Sean finally said, but he looked troubled. After breakfast, we broke camp with our usual efficiency. Max seemed eager to leave, pulling at his leash as I packed the last of my gear. The fog had lifted somewhat, revealing a landscape of rolling hills covered in heather and gorse. Beautiful, but somehow forbidding. "So, are we going to this village or not?" Diane asked as we shouldered our packs. Sean hesitated, then nodded. "Why not, if it's only a couple miles out of our way?" Eric led us along a barely visible trail that wound between stands of ancient oak trees. The ground beneath our boots was soft with centuries of fallen leaves. After about an hour of hiking, Eric stopped abruptly, consulting his map. "That's strange," he muttered. "What is?" I moved beside him to look at the map. "According to this, we should be able to see Clogmore by now. It should be right there." He pointed to a small valley below us, empty except for tall grass and a few grazing sheep. Maybe your map's wrong, Sean suggested. Maybe, Eric conceded, but he didn't sound convinced. Let's keep going a little further. We continued along the trail, which began to descend toward the valley. The day had warmed considerably, and I stopped to remove my jacket, tying it around my waist. As I did, I noticed Diane staring at me strangely. "What?" I asked. "Where's your necklace?" My hand automatically went to my throat, finding nothing. The silver pendant, a gift from my grandmother, was gone. I was wearing it yesterday," I said, feeling a flutter of panic. The necklace was one of my most treasured possessions. I never take it off. "Maybe the clasp broke," Diane suggested. "We can retrace our steps a bit." "No," Sean interjected firmly. "We don't have time if we want to reach the cliffs by sunset." "It's important to her," Diane argued. "It's fine," I said, though it wasn't. "Let's keep going." As we continued walking, I kept thinking about the necklace. I couldn't remember taking it off or feeling it break. It was simply gone, as if it had never been there at all. By midday, we stopped for lunch in a sheltered hollow. The sky had darkened, threatening rain. Eric spread the map out again, frowning. "This doesn't make sense," he said. "We should have reached Clogmore by now." "Maybe it was more than 2 miles," Sean suggested, unwrapping a protein bar. "No, I'm sure." Eric trailed off, staring at the map as if willing it to reveal some hidden truth. Diane leaned over. "Let me see." Eric handed her the map. She studied it for a moment, then looked up, confused. "There's no village marked on here." "What?" Eric snatched the map back. "Of course there is. Right here." He pointed to a spot on the map. "That's just a contour line," Diane said gently. "There's no village marker." Eric stared at the map, then at Diane, then back at the map. "But I saw it yesterday. Clogmore. It was right there." Sean and I exchanged concerned glances. "Maybe you were tired," I suggested. "It was pretty dark." Eric folded the map with jerky movements. "I know what I saw." The rest of our lunch passed in uncomfortable silence. Rain began to fall lightly as we packed up. Max stayed unusually close to me, pressing against my leg whenever we stopped. "New plan," Sean announced. "We head straight north from here. Should hit the main trail in a couple of hours, then west to the cliffs." No one argued. We walked single file, Sean leading, then Diane, me with Max, and Eric bringing up the rear. The rain increased steadily, soaking through our supposedly waterproof jackets. The landscape seemed to close in around us, trees looming closer, the trail becoming less distinct. "Hey!" Eric called from behind me. "Do those look like buildings to anyone else?" We all stopped, peering through the rain at what appeared to be low stone structures in the distance. "Sheep pens," Sean suggested. "No," Eric said. "Houses. It's Clogmore." Without waiting for a response, he set off toward the structures. After a moment's hesitation, we followed. As we drew closer, I could see that Eric was right. They were houses, or what remained of them. Stone cottages with collapsed roofs, arranged in a rough semicircle around what might once have been a village green. In the center stood a well, its stone rim worn smooth by time and weather. "See," Eric said triumphantly. "I told you it was here." Sean nodded slowly. "You did." He sounded troubled. We wandered among the ruins, seeking shelter from the rain. Most of the cottages were little more than 3 crumbling walls and scattered stones, but one structure remained relatively intact. We ducked inside, grateful to escape the downpour. The interior was a single room, maybe 15 feet square. The roof had partially collapsed, but enough remained to keep out most of the rain. A stone hearth dominated one wall, cold and empty for over a century. "Should we stay here tonight?" Diane asked, dropping her pack. "I don't fancy hiking in this weather." Sean checked his wrist reflexively, then frowned, remembering his missing watch. "What time is it?" No one answered. I realized with a start that I didn't know. My phone was dead, not surprising after 3 days in the wilderness, but my own watch was also missing. I hadn't noticed until now. I think we should keep moving, Eric said, his earlier enthusiasm for finding the village now replaced by unease. It's pouring, Diane countered, and we're already wet and tired. In the end, the weather made the decision for us. The rain intensified, becoming a torrential downpour that made visibility nearly impossible. We reluctantly set up our tents inside the cottage. An odd sight, these modern nylon domes within ancient stone walls. Max refused to lie down. He paced the perimeter of our tent, occasionally growling at the stone walls. He's been acting weird since yesterday, Diane observed as we ate a cold dinner of trail mix and jerky. None of us felt like setting up the stove. Remember how he wouldn't go near those stones? I said. Sean looked up sharply. What stones? I stared at him. The circle of stones, where we camped last night. Sean's expression was completely blank. We camped in a clearing. Yes, a clearing with a circle of stones, I insisted. You even said it was marked on your map. Sean shook his head slowly. I don't remember any stones. I do, Diane offered. They were arranged in a perfect circle. Eric was watching Sean with concern. You really don't remember? No, Sean said firmly. There weren't any stones. An uncomfortable silence fell. Outside, the rain hammered against the remaining sections of roof. Water dripped steadily in one corner of the cottage. I'm going to try to get some sleep, Sean finally said, retreating to the tent he shared with Eric. Diane and I exchanged worried glances before following suit. In our tent, Max finally settled next to me, though his body remained tense. I stroked his coarse fur, trying to soothe him. What do you think is going on with Sean? Diane whispered. I don't know, I admitted. First the watch, now this. Do you think... She hesitated. Do you think it has something to do with those stones? What, like Eric's fairy ring? I attempted a laugh that sounded hollow even to my own ears. You've lost something too, she reminded me. Your necklace. I touched my bare throat again. That doesn't mean anything. It probably just fell off while we were hiking. Diane was silent for so long I thought she'd fallen asleep. Then, what if we all lose something? What if it's not just objects? What do you mean? Sean lost his watch. You lost your necklace. What if we're all going to lose something? I didn't answer. Outside, the rain had stopped, leaving an eerie silence. I eventually drifted into an uneasy sleep, dreaming of stone circles and whispering voices that called my name. Morning came with fog again, thicker than the day before. When I emerged from our tent, I found Eric sitting alone by the cold hearth, staring at nothing. Morning, I said, digging through my pack for a breakfast bar. He looked up at me, his expression puzzled. Who are you? I laughed, then stopped when his expression didn't change. Very funny. I'm not joking, he said, his voice small and frightened. I don't know who you are, or where we are, or... His breathing quickened. I don't know who I am. I knelt beside him, alarmed. Eric, it's me. We're friends. We're hiking in Ireland. Remember? He shook his head slowly. I don't remember anything. Sean emerged from their tent, taking in the scene with a quick glance. What's wrong? It's Eric, I said. He doesn't remember who he is. Sean's face drained of color. Christ, what's happening? Diane appeared beside me, her hair tousled from sleep. Eric has amnesia or something, I explained. He doesn't recognize any of us. That's impossible, Diane said. Then, to Eric, what's the last thing you remember? Eric's eyes were wide and frightened. Waking up, just now. Nothing before that. Sean ran a hand through his hair. This is crazy. We need to get him to a doctor. The nearest town is at least a day's hike, I reminded him. Then we start hiking, Sean said firmly. Pack up. Now. We broke camp in tense silence. Eric allowed Sean to guide him through the process of packing his gear, his movements mechanical. Max stayed close to my side, occasionally looking up at me with worried eyes. As we stepped outside the ruined cottage, the fog was beginning to lift. And that's when I saw them. Look, I whispered, pointing. On the edge of the village stood 7 stones arranged in a perfect circle. The same stones from our first campsite or identical ones. That's not possible, Sean breathed. Those weren't there yesterday. Just like the village wasn't on the map? I asked. No one answered. We approached the stone circle cautiously. In the growing light, I could see faint markings on the stones. Spirals and curved lines worn nearly smooth by centuries of weather. We need to leave, Sean said suddenly. Now. We skirted the stone circle, giving it a wide berth. Max didn't need any encouragement to avoid it this time. Our planned route was forgotten. We simply headed in the opposite direction from the stones, following a faint trail that led uphill through a stand of gnarled oak trees. After an hour of silent hiking, Diane gasped and stopped abruptly. My ring, she said, staring at her left hand. It's gone. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. The simple silver band Diane always wore, a gift from her mother, was missing. When did you last see it? Sean asked, his voice tight. I always wear it, she said. I never take it off, not even to shower. None of us suggested turning back to look for it. We continued climbing, the landscape becoming more rugged. The trail disappeared and reappeared, as if unsure of its own existence. By midday, we reached a ridge that offered a view of the surrounding countryside. Miles of undulating hills stretched in all directions, with no sign of roads or buildings or other humans. I think we're lost, Sean admitted, studying his compass with a frown. Let me see, I said, holding out my hand for the compass. Sean passed it to me. The needle spun lazily, refusing to settle on a direction. That's not right, I muttered. Is it broken? It was working yesterday, Sean said. The sky darkened suddenly, though it was barely afternoon. A strange stillness fell over the landscape, as if the world were holding its breath. We need to find shelter, Sean said, looking up at the threatening sky. There might be another storm coming. No more ruins, Diane said firmly. Let's use the tents. We found a relatively flat area protected by a cluster of large boulders. As we set up our tents, I noticed Eric watching us with the focused attention of someone trying to learn an unfamiliar task. He still didn't remember who he was or who we were. Maybe he hit his head, Diane suggested quietly as we collected water from a nearby stream. Or maybe it's some kind of stress reaction. To what? I asked. We were having a good time until... I trailed off, unsure how to finish that sentence. Until the stones? Until the missing watch and necklace and ring? By nightfall, clouds had blotted out the stars and moon, leaving us in profound darkness broken only by our small lanterns. We huddled together between the tents, eating the last of our trail mix and speaking little. How long until we reach a town? Eric asked, his voice that of a stranger. Tomorrow, hopefully, Sean replied, if we keep heading east. How do you know that's east? I asked. The compass doesn't work. Sean didn't answer. We could try using the sun, Diane suggested. It rises in the east. If we can see it, I said, glancing at the heavy cloud cover. We retreated to our tents earlier than usual, the strange oppressive darkness making us uneasy. In hours, Diane fell asleep quickly while I lay awake, listening to Max's steady breathing beside me. Despite everything, the dog had finally relaxed enough to sleep. I must have drifted off eventually because suddenly I was jerking awake to the sound of voices. Not our voices, not human voices at all. They were high and musical, speaking in a language I couldn't understand but that somehow seemed almost familiar, as if I'd heard it in a dream. I sat up, careful not to disturb Diane or Max. The voices seemed to be coming from outside the tent. Slowly, I unzipped the entrance and peered out. The night had cleared. Stars blazed overhead, impossibly bright, and in their light, I could see them. They moved among our camp like curious children, touching our equipment, examining the fabric of our tents. They were small, perhaps 4 feet tall and slender, with long limbs that moved with unnatural grace. Their skin seemed to shimmer in the starlight, and their eyes, when they turned toward me, were entirely black without whites or pupils. I should have been terrified. Instead, I felt a strange calm, as if I were still dreaming. One of them approached me, tilting its head like a curious bird. It reached out a long-fingered hand and touched my cheek lightly. "So you're the last one." The words appeared in my mind without passing through my ears. "The last one what?" I whispered. "The last to forget." Around us, the others had stopped their examination of our camp and were watching me with their black, bottomless eyes. "You came to our circle. You slept within our stones. You woke us from our long sleep." "We didn't know," I said, though I wasn't sure what I was apologizing for. They never do. There was something like amusement in the thought, but the debt must still be paid. "What debt?" "One night in our realm, one memory from yours. A fair exchange, wouldn't you say?" I thought of Sean's watch, my necklace, Diane's ring. "You took our things. Tokens only. Reminders of what was lost. And Eric? His memory? He gave us himself. A greater gift deserves a greater taking." Fear finally broke through my dreamlike calm. "What will you take from me?" The creature's head tilted again, considering. "What would you give?" Before I could answer, Max erupted from the tent behind me, barking furiously. The creatures scattered like startled deer, their forms blurring as they moved with impossible speed toward the edge of our camp. In seconds, they were gone. The commotion woke Diane and the others. They emerged from their tents, confused and alarmed. "What happened?" Sean demanded. I opened my mouth to explain, then stopped. Already the memory of what I'd seen was fading, becoming hazy and dreamlike. Had I actually seen anything at all? "Just Max," I said finally. "Probably heard a fox or something." We returned to our tents, but I couldn't sleep. I lay awake until dawn, listening for those high, musical voices, but heard only the normal sounds of the night, the rustle of leaves, the distant call of an owl. Morning brought sunlight and a clear sky. As we packed up camp, Eric approached me hesitantly. "I remember you," he said. "Not everything, but bits and pieces. We're friends." I nodded, relief washing over me. "We are. I don't remember how we got here, though," he continued, frowning. "Or why we're here." "We're hiking," I explained. "In Ireland. You wanted to see an abandoned village called Clogmore." His expression remained blank. "I don't remember that." We hiked all day, following the sun eastward. By late afternoon, we reached a paved road. An hour later, a passing farmer gave us a ride to the nearest town. A collection of whitewashed buildings clustered around a small harbor. At the local clinic, a doctor examined Eric and found nothing physically wrong. "Temporary amnesia," she suggested. "Possibly stress-induced. Rest is the best medicine." We found rooms at a small inn overlooking the harbor. After hot showers and a proper meal, we gathered in Sean and Eric's room to discuss what had happened. "So we all lost something," Diane summarized. "Sean's watch, your necklace, my ring, and Eric lost himself. But he's getting his memory back," Sean pointed out. "Maybe it was just exhaustion or dehydration or something." "And our missing items?" I asked. "All coincidence?" No one had an answer for that. "What about you?" Eric asked me suddenly. "What did you lose?" I opened my mouth to say nothing, but stopped. There was something important, hovering just at the edge of my consciousness. Something I'd seen or heard or experienced that was now gone, leaving only the faintest impression like a footprint in sand after the tide has nearly erased it. "I don't know," I admitted. That night, I dreamed of standing in a circle of stones under a sky filled with impossible stars. Small figures with black eyes moved around me, their voices high and musical. One reached out to touch my face with long, cool fingers. "A fair exchange," it said, though no lips moved. "You may keep your trinkets and your friend's self. In return, we take only this, the memory of us." I woke with a start, heart racing. For a moment, I could almost grasp it, the thing I'd lost. Then it slipped away, leaving me with nothing but a vague unease and the certainty that something important had happened that I could no longer recall. The others gradually recovered their missing items. Sean's watch turned up in a side pocket of his backpack. My necklace was found tangled in my sleeping bag. Diane's ring was discovered in the bottom of her toiletry kit. Eric's memory returned slowly over the next few days, though certain details remained permanently blank. We finished our hiking trip without further incident, sticking to well-traveled paths and established campgrounds. When we returned to our respective homes and jobs, we shared photos and laughed about our adventure in rural Ireland. But sometimes, when I'm alone in the dark, I feel the phantom touch of long, cool fingers on my cheek. And Max still refuses to go near certain arrangements of stones, hackles rising, a low growl rumbling in his chest. In those moments, I almost remember what I've forgotten, almost, but not quite. Whatever happened in those hills, whatever debt was paid, I can't help feeling we got off lightly. Because sometimes forgetting isn't a loss. Sometimes it's a mercy. There were bite marks on the inside of the tent, but only on mine. I discovered them on my third morning in the Pilbara. Tiny punctures, like someone had taken a sewing needle to the synthetic fabric. Not enough to let the elements in, just enough to form a pattern. A perfect circle, about the size of a quarter, made up of dozens of minute perforations. I ran my finger over them, feeling the slight roughness where the fibers had been disturbed. Strange, but not alarming, not yet. I figured it was some quirk of the manufacturing process that I'd somehow never noticed. Or maybe insects. The Australian outback teemed with life, most of it equipped with pincers, stingers, or fangs. But insects don't chew from the inside. I was 30 days into what was supposed to be a 6-week solo trek across one of the oldest landscapes on Earth. The Pilbara region of Western Australia isn't exactly a tourist hotspot. It's a place of ancient red rock, spinifex grass, and a sky so vast it makes you feel like an afterthought. During the day, the heat is a living thing that wraps around you, squeezing the moisture from your body. At night, the stars are so bright and numerous they seem like they might come crashing down at any moment. I'd saved for this trip for years, spent months planning routes, gathering supplies, training my body to handle the harsh conditions. I wanted isolation, wanted to prove something to myself after my life back home had collapsed under the weight of a failed marriage and a career that had withered on the vine. 30 days in, I'd been managing well, had seen only 2 other humans, a pair of geologists in a land cruiser who'd stopped to check I wasn't dying of dehydration. I'd established a rhythm: walk before dawn, rest during the brutal midday heat, walk again until dusk, then make camp. I'd learned the small tricks of survival: how to find water in seemingly barren creek beds, how to read the weather in the shape of distant clouds. I was healing in that way that only emptiness can heal. The vastness of the landscape had a way of putting human problems into perspective. I shrugged off those first bite marks and packed up camp. As I collapsed the tent, folding it carefully into my pack, I noticed how the punctures disappeared in the natural creases of the fabric. By midday, I'd forgotten about them entirely. That night, I camped in the shadow of a massive rust-colored outcropping. The locals call them tors, ancient granite formations shaped by millions of years of wind and rain into impossible sculptures. This one looked like a crouching giant, permanently frozen in stone. After dinner, dehydrated pasta that tasted better than any 5-star meal simply because of my hunger, I sat outside watching the sky transform. The sunset in the Pilbara doesn't just happen. It announces itself like the end of the world. The entire horizon burns crimson, then fades through impossible gradients of orange and purple before darkness swallows it whole. As the last light disappeared, I heard it for the first time. A chittering sound. Not quite insect, not quite bird. A dry, clicking noise that seemed to come from the rocks above me. I shined my headlamp up at the tor, but the beam disappeared into darkness long before it reached the top. The sound stopped immediately. "Hello!" I called out, feeling foolish even as I did so. My voice sounded small against the enormity of the landscape. No response except the gentle rustle of spinifex grass in the evening breeze. I crawled into my tent, zipping it securely and settling into my sleeping bag. The temperature drops dramatically at night in the desert. Despite the day's heat, I needed the thermal protection. I woke sometime later to that sound again. Chit, 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 chit. like teeth or tiny claws tapping against hard surfaces. Closer now, just outside my tent. I lay perfectly still, ears straining. My headlamp was within reach, but I hesitated to turn it on. Some primal instinct told me to remain quiet, to pretend I wasn't there. The chittering moved around the perimeter of my tent. Deliberate, methodical. Whatever was making the noise seemed to be inspecting my shelter, circling it completely before returning to the point where it had started. Then silence. I waited, barely breathing, for what felt like hours. Eventually, exhaustion pulled me back into uneasy sleep. Morning revealed more bite marks. A second perfect circle, identical to the first but on the opposite side of the tent. I examined them closely. They looked fresh, the edges of the tiny punctures still slightly raised. I took photos with my phone, zooming in as much as the camera would allow. Then I sent them to my sister back in Melbourne, along with a joking message about Australian bugs with OCD. The message didn't go through, no signal. I'd have to try again when I reached higher ground. I pushed on that day, covering nearly 15 miles across increasingly rugged terrain. The landscape had changed subtly, the smooth desert floor giving way to broken ground cut through with dry creek beds and small ravines. I was heading deeper into the ancient heart of the Pilbara, toward a place the topographical maps labeled simply as the Columns. That afternoon, I ran into a wizened Aboriginal man walking in the opposite direction. He carried nothing but a walking stick and a small canvas bag. In the middle of nowhere, wearing clothes that looked decades old. Faded jeans and a checked shirt that had once been blue but had been bleached nearly white by the sun. "Day," I said, surprised to see another person. He nodded but didn't return the greeting. His eyes, milky with cataracts, fixed on my pack. "You camping?" he asked finally, his voice rough as sandpaper. "Yes, heading to the Columns. Should get there tomorrow." He shook his head slowly. "Not good camping there, especially not now." "Why's that?" "Waking time." I waited for more explanation, but he seemed to think those two words sufficient. "Waking time," I prompted. He tapped his walking stick against the red earth. "Some places they sleep for long time, then they wake up hungry." He pointed at my tent, strapped to the outside of my backpack. "That won't help you." I forced a smile. "Well, I appreciate the warning, but I've got good gear. I'll be fine." He shrugged, a gesture that seemed to release him from responsibility for my fate. "Your people never listen. Always think you know better." Before I could respond, he was moving past me, continuing on his way with surprising speed for someone who appeared to be at least 70 years old. "Wait!" I called after him. "Is there something specific I should watch out for?" He paused without turning around. "If you hear them chittering, you're already marked." My blood went cold. I hadn't mentioned the sound to him. "What's chittering?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. "The hungry ones. They taste first small bites, then they come back for more." With that, he continued walking. Within minutes, the heat haze had swallowed him completely, as if he'd never existed at all. That night, I made camp earlier than usual, choosing a spot near a small seasonal waterhole that still held a few inches of muddy liquid. I needed to filter more drinking water, and the task gave me something practical to focus on instead of the old man's warning. The sunset was different that evening, the usual riot of color muted by a thin layer of high clouds. The air felt strange too, not quite humid, but heavy somehow, like it had absorbed something from the earth that made it denser. I secured my tent meticulously, checking each stake and guy line twice. Inside, I arranged my gear in a neat semicircle. Headlamp, knife, satellite phone, useless without clear sky, but comforting nonetheless, and water bottle all within easy reach. Sleep came reluctantly, and when it did, it brought dreams of tiny teeth working their way through fabric, through skin, through muscle. The chittering woke me just after midnight. I know it was midnight because I checked my watch immediately, its illuminated face casting a weak green glow inside the tent. The sound was different this time, more coordinated somehow. Instead of a single source circling my tent, it came from multiple directions at once. A synchronized chorus of clicking and tapping. I reached for my headlamp with trembling fingers and snapped it on. The beam caught something moving on the tent wall. A shadow, elongated and distorted by the fabric. Something with too many limbs. I scrambled upright, the sleeping bag tangling around my legs. The shadow vanished instantly. The chittering stopped. I kept the light on, swinging it around the interior of the tent. Nothing looked disturbed. Nothing looked wrong. But the silence felt watchful, expectant. "Hello!" I called out, hating the quaver in my voice. "Is someone there?" No response. Just the vast, listening silence of the outback night. I didn't sleep again. Sat upright until dawn broke, headlamp trained on the tent walls, watching for shadows. By the time the first gray light filtered through the fabric, my eyes burned with exhaustion, and my back ached from maintaining the same rigid position for hours. The new bite marks formed a perfect triangle with the previous two circles. Dozens of tiny punctures, each no larger than a pinhead. But this time something was different. I leaned closer, squinting in the early morning light. The newest marks weren't just punctures. They were slightly elongated, as if whatever had made them had twisted as it bit, tearing the fabric minutely. And they were bigger. Not by much, maybe the difference between a sewing needle and a safety pin, but definitely larger than the previous night's marks. Something else was different too. When I ran my finger over them, my skin came away damp. The punctures had some kind of residue, clear and slightly viscous, like thin saliva. My stomach churned. I quickly wiped my finger on my pants. I should have turned back then. Should have abandoned the trek and headed for the nearest road, the nearest township. The old Aboriginal man's warning echoed in my mind. If you hear them chittering, you're already marked. But some strange combination of stubbornness, fear of failure, and disbelief pushed me forward. I was less than a day's hike from the columns, the geological formation I'd traveled halfway around the world to see. And despite the unsettling events, I still hadn't seen anything truly threatening. Strange bite marks and mysterious sounds weren't enough to make me abandon months of planning and preparation. I broke camp quickly and set out, pushing myself harder than usual. The terrain grew increasingly difficult. Jagged outcroppings of ancient rock, deep gullies carved by long-vanished rivers, tangled thickets of spinifex that slashed at my legs if I got too close. By late afternoon, I crested a rise and saw the columns spread out before me. They were unlike anything I'd ever seen. Hundreds of hexagonal stone pillars rising from the red earth, some nearly 30 feet tall, their surfaces weathered by millennia of wind and rain into alien geometries. They looked artificial, too perfectly formed to be natural, yet they'd stood here for time beyond human reckoning. As I descended toward them, I felt a strange vibration in the soles of my feet, as if the ground itself was humming. The air grew heavier still, carrying a metallic tang that coated my tongue. I found a relatively flat space among the towering formations and set up camp. The stone columns cast long shadows as the sun began its descent, creating a complex pattern of light and darkness across the ground. I noticed that the soil here was different, darker, almost black in places, with an oily sheen when the light hit it at certain angles. For the first time since beginning my trek, I felt truly uneasy about where I'd chosen to sleep. The columns loomed over my small tent, seeming to bend inward slightly, as if peering down at me. That was nonsense, of course. Geological formations don't move, don't watch. It was just the fatigue and the strange events of the past few nights playing tricks on my mind. Still, I collected more rocks than usual to secure my tent stakes, hammering them deeper into the hard ground. I ate dinner inside rather than out under the stars, as had been my custom, and I left my boots on, laces loosened but still on my feet, just in case I needed to move quickly in the night. The chittering began before the sun had fully set. It emanated from the columns themselves, a rhythmic clicking that seemed to pass from one stone pillar to another, circling my position. Unlike previous nights, it didn't stop when I turned on my headlamp or called out. If anything, it intensified, growing louder and more insistent. Then I noticed something that made the hair on my arms stand up. The sound had a pattern to it. 3 quick clicks, a pause, for slow ones another pause, then 3 quick again. Over and over. Not random noise, but communication. I zipped myself securely into my tent and tried the satellite phone again. No signal. The screen showed only the spinning icon that indicated it was searching for a connection. I switched it off to conserve battery power. I try again later. As darkness fell completely, I became aware of movement outside. Not the normal rustling of nocturnal animals or the whisper of wind through the spinifex. This was deliberate movement, something with weight shifting across the ground around my tent. I kept perfectly still, hardly daring to breathe. My headlamp illuminated only the interior of the tent, creating a small bubble of light that made the darkness beyond seem all the more impenetrable. The chittering continued, now so close it seemed to be coming from just inches away, on the other side of the thin fabric wall. Then something pressed against the side of the tent. Not hard, just enough to create a slight indentation in the fabric. A delicate touch, like someone or something testing the barrier between us. I watched, paralyzed, as the indentation moved slowly upward, tracing an invisible line from near the ground to just above where I sat huddled in my sleeping bag. The pressure disappeared, then came again in a different spot, then another. Multiple points of contact now, moving independently of each other, exploring the contours of my shelter. The tent fabric bulged inward in several places simultaneously, creating a nightmarish topography of protrusions that corresponded to nothing I could imagine. Some were thin and elongated, others round and bulbous. All moved with disturbing precision. I reached for my knife with trembling hands. The blade seemed pathetically small against whatever was out there, but its solid weight offered some small comfort. The chittering changed pitch, becoming higher, more excited. The pressure against the tent increased, the fabric stretching taut in dozens of places. Then, without warning, everything stopped. The chittering fell silent. The protrusions withdrew all at once, leaving the tent walls hanging slack. In the sudden, absolute silence, I could hear my own ragged breathing, too loud in the confined space. I waited, knife clutched to my chest, for what felt like hours. Nothing. Eventually, despite my terror, exhaustion claimed me. I fell into fitful sleep, still sitting upright, still gripping the knife. I jerked awake to the sound of fabric tearing. For a disoriented moment, I thought it was my tent being ripped apart. But the noise came from inside, from my own pack. Something was shredding the contents. I fumbled for my headlamp and switched it on. Yellow eyes reflected the beam back at me, dozens of them, filling the small space of my tent. They belonged to creatures unlike anything I'd ever seen or imagined, each about the size of a large rat, with bodies that seemed composed primarily of multi-jointed limbs radiating from a central mass. No discernible head, just those glowing eyes distributed across their surfaces. Their skin, if you could call it that, was a mottled pattern of deep red and black that perfectly matched the coloration of the surrounding landscape. They had been hiding in plain sight all along. The creatures froze in my light, limbs extended in various positions of destruction. One had torn open my pack and was extracting the contents. Others were arranged across the tent walls, their limbs pressing against the fabric from the inside this time. Still others huddled near my feet, where they'd been working on my boots. I screamed then, a raw sound that tore from my throat with such force it was painful. The creatures responded with a burst of chittering that seemed almost conversational. Then they moved, flowing toward me with terrifying grace. Too many limbs working in perfect coordination, propelling them across the ground, up the walls, across the ceiling of the tent. I slashed wildly with my knife, connecting with something that made a wet, crunching sound. One of the creatures fell, leaking a clear fluid identical to what I'd found on the bite marks. The others paused, their yellow eyes fixing on their fallen companion, then on me. The chittering changed tone, became deeper, angrier. I took advantage of their momentary hesitation and lunged for the tent zipper, tearing it open and stumbling out into the night. The cold air hit me like a physical blow after the close confines of the tent. The columns stood silhouetted against the star-filled sky, their hexagonal shapes now seeming less like geological formations and more like the cells of a vast honeycomb. And they were vibrating, a subtle movement that sent tremors through the ground beneath my feet. From inside my ruined tent came a frenzy of chittering and tearing sounds. The creatures were destroying everything I'd brought with me. I ran, barefoot and panicked, deeper into the maze of stone pillars. My headlamp bounced wildly, the beams slicing through darkness to reveal glimpses of the alien landscape. More of the creatures scuttled between the columns, their movements synchronized, purposeful. They were hurting me. I realized this too late, after I'd been channeled into a natural amphitheater formed by a circle of particularly tall pillars. I skidded to a halt on the dark soil, my light revealing hundreds of the multi-limbed creatures arranged on the columns like spectators in some grotesque arena. And in the center of the amphitheater, something was emerging from the ground. The black soil bulged upward, cracking and splitting as something massive pushed its way to the surface. The chittering reached a crescendo, the individual sounds blending into a continuous, maddening thrum that seemed to vibrate in my bones. What rose from the earth defied comprehension. A vast articulated body, similar in form to the smaller creatures but scaled up to nightmare proportions. It unfolded itself segment by segment, limb by limb, until it towered over me, blocking out the stars. Its surface rippled with the same mottled pattern as the smaller ones, but interspersed among the red and black were bits of color and texture I recognized with horror, fragments of synthetic fabric, identical to my tent material, incorporated somehow into its hide. Yellow eyes opened across its surface, each fixing on me with terrible intelligence. I stood transfixed, the knife hanging uselessly at my side. My headlamp beam, seeming pathetically inadequate now, illuminated only a small portion of the entity, leaving much of it in shadow. It didn't matter. I didn't need to see all of it to understand what was happening. The bite marks on my tent hadn't been tests or warnings. They'd been samples. The creature had been tasting my shelter, incorporating its material into itself, preparing, growing. A sound emerged from somewhere within the massive entity, not the chittering of the smaller creatures, but a deep, resonant hum that made the air itself seem to shiver. The sound formed patterns, almost like words, almost like meaning. What saved me wasn't courage or quick thinking or any particular skill. It was simple, blind luck. As the entity reached for me with limbs that terminated in appendages too numerous and complex to count, the ground beneath us shuddered violently. An earthquake, a common enough occurrence in this ancient landscape. Not powerful enough to cause serious damage, but enough to disrupt whatever ritual was unfolding. The massive creature paused, its limbs retracting slightly. The smaller ones chittered in what sounded like alarm. The columns themselves swayed, though whether from the tremor or from some sympathetic connection to the entities, I couldn't tell. I didn't wait to find out. I turned and ran, no longer caring which direction, just away from the amphitheater, away from the emerging horror at its center. Behind me, the chittering rose to a frenzied pitch, then cut off abruptly. The sudden silence was almost as terrifying as the sound had been. I ran until my bare feet were cut and bleeding, until my lungs burned, until even terror couldn't keep me moving. I collapsed beside one of the countless dry creek beds that veined the landscape, crawling under an overhanging bank where the soil had been eroded by long-ago floods. There, hidden in the earth like some wounded animal, I waited for dawn. It came with agonizing slowness, the first gray light revealing a landscape that looked ordinary, unthreatening. The columns were visible in the distance, rising from the red earth exactly as geological formations should, showing no sign of the nightmare they had contained. Had I imagined it all? Some combination of isolation, heat, and exhaustion producing an elaborate hallucination? The wounds on my feet argued otherwise, as did the complete absence of my gear. My tent, my pack, my supplies, everything was gone, consumed or destroyed by the chittering entities that had emerged from the heart of this ancient place. I walked for 3 days, following creek beds where the walking was easier on my injured feet. I drank from stagnant pools, not caring about parasites or bacteria. Found just enough bush tucker to keep moving, a skill learned from a guidebook that now seemed absurdly inadequate preparation for survival in this land. On the 4th day, I stumbled onto a mining access road and was picked up by a crew of baffled geologists who thought at first I was an indigent rather than a tourist. They gave me water, bandaged my feet, and drove me to the nearest township, a dusty collection of buildings that serviced the mines and the scattered cattle stations of the region. The local police were sympathetic but skeptical of my story. Lost hikers were not uncommon, nor were the resulting confusion and dehydration that could lead to vivid hallucinations. They filed a report about my missing equipment, but held little hope of recovery. Dingoes probably scattered it, the officer suggested kindly, or other hikers might have stumbled on it and taken what was useful. I didn't argue. What could I say that wouldn't sound like the ravings of a sunstruck mind? But sometimes, in the deepest part of night, I hear it again, that dry, rhythmic chittering. Not from outside my window, but from somewhere much closer. Inside my apartment, inside my head. And when I change the sheets on my bed, I sometimes find them marked with tiny punctures. Perfect circles of them, arranged in patterns that seem almost like writing, almost like a message. The doctors say it's a form of parasitosis delusion, the false belief that one is infested with parasites. A not uncommon psychological response to trauma. But they haven't seen what comes through my window on moonless nights. Haven't heard the soft click of too many limbs on hardwood floors. Haven't felt the weight of ancient hunger pressing against the foot of the bed. They weren't there in the oldest place on earth, when something woke up hungry after a sleep of millions of years. They weren't marked. I am, and sometimes, when I look at my skin in the harsh light of morning, I see the faintest pattern emerging. A mottled texture of red and black that perfectly matches the colorations of the Pilbara landscape. The bite marks are on the inside now, and they're growing larger every night.